Cowboy Grak 5, Yet Another Fistful of Obols, by gazemaize.
Summary. It's hard to believe, but out there in the sands, hidden among the rustlers, vagrants, and ne'er-do-wells, there still roams a hero. Now, he ain't like the ones your granddad told you about, and he's got his own inscrutable code. But when this dying world of ours tries to snuff your candle and you're up a creek without a paddle, know that there's at least one man you can always count on. He has many names. The chipped boulder of the 10th mountain, Two-Nostril Tex, the great uniter of the nation of Tar, El Mineral, the Kier Kid. Sniff, but he's humble. He don't respond to none of that. If you want him to come and save your hide, only one name will do it. You call for Cowboy Grak.
It was high noon, and all of town had gathered in front of the saloon. By the front doors was Mrs. Fennett, the salacious bar owner and widow, who could often be found dramatically fanning herself and revealing perhaps slightly too much cleavage for a lady of good standing, even by the standards of their wild frontier outpost. Aside from her were the various eclectic citizens and drifters in town, who happened to be, not that it mattered, disproportionately muscular, shirtless, and well-oiled. The dirt road itself was clear, aside from two opposing figures. On the right of the saloon was the dastardly villain Jimapore Steele, one of the most despised outlaws in the West, who had only days earlier shot the Shire Reeve in cold blood. He looked very bored. Naturally, facing him down was the titular Cowboy Grak lead boots.
"This town is large,"
said Cowboy Grak, with a heroic sniff.
"It is not adequate to contain us both. Your crimes are numerous."
Jimapore sighed. It was said that a beam of light, if fired inside the plane of mirrors, would rebound infinitely. That was the best analogy anyone had come up with to describe how unfalteringly the Fens could run a shitty joke into the ground. The current shitty joke was Cowboy Grak, as it had been for the last 2 weeks. The narrator, no nickname had ever stuck, in spite of a bevy of excellent suggestions from Angel and Devil, which they had stopped saying aloud, but firmly committed to referring to him as in their shared, internal dialogue, had been very vocal during an earlier discussion that Cowboy Grak wasn't funny, or that if it was funny, it was the kind of joke/sad low-effort postmodern meme that benefited from the least amount of elaboration possible. Noon claimed that the platonic ideal of Grak being a cowboy might have been funny, but that it was impossible to communicate that concept without all of the humor being lost in the act of transference, regardless of the format, except as possibly a very compressed JPEG.
It's like one of those instances where people get enamored with a 2-minute skit on YouTube or an SNL sketch or an Onion headline, or something comparably short, and they instantly think it needs to be made into a movie or something more long-form. And in my experience, that doesn't end well most of the time,
said Smithy.
It's this unspoken fallacy that, if an idea for a joke is good, more of that idea will be better. And no, it's usually exactly the opposite, because in practice you just end up diluting the concept with more time than the premise justifies, and having to sit through all that pointless filler destroys the impact of whatever good material was present in the first place.
You did an entire campaign about a 3-minute parody video about a random actor being a cannibal, and the entire joke there, when you strip it down, is what if specific person was silly thing. Grak is a specific person, and cowboy is a silly thing. You are being needlessly nitpicky and hypocritical because you are jealous of the sheer magnificence that is Cowboy Grak, because it is the best combination of specific person and silly thing to ever exist, and because we came up with it, not you. We rest our case.
Purgatorio Fen closed her eyes and gave herself a high five.
Well, I didn't come up with the idea for making that into a game. Somebody else online wrote the rules for it,
said July.
And it wasn't an entire campaign. It was 2 short sessions 6 months apart. And that only works because even in the 2 pages of rules it establishes that the players and the DM are working with campy horror movie tropes, and everything that implies, which opens up an entire genre of ideas to play around with. So it's an oversimplification to say that game as we played it stemmed from us improvising off a dumb 1-sentence premise. The exceptions to the kind of bad extended adaptational things I'm talking about are when the original concept can be used as a springboard for developing and playing around with other interesting ideas, but that takes effort and planning, and not every original idea is suited for it.
What? You don't think Cowboy Grak is a wellspring of creative potential?
No.
said June.
Cowboy Grak is funny because you don't elaborate on it.
Dante was wrong, obviously. So, after a few more paragraphs of that, he had started talking about something called minimal descriptive length, because it wasn't a conversation with June if he didn't say something that necessitated a trip to Wikipedia. They told him to shut up, and that it was Devil's turn to pick the light dive. Since he was the best of all possible junipers, he did as he was told, but not without just the right amount of bitching beforehand. Other store-brand Junes and Boons would allow themselves to be steamrolled, almost immediately, to advance past frivolous arguments or impassively take the debate far more seriously than was necessary, without getting baited into any unrelated juniper rants, TM. Both of these solutions tragically missed the real reason for Cowboy Grak and all of Fenn's other terrible repetitive memes, to annoy the shit out of him.
"This ain't none of your concern,"
replied the criminal, who was mumbling.
"I never rustled nothing from you."
Cowboy Grak took a step forward, his gold spurs spinning slowly from the movement.
It has become my business. You have shot both this good town's shire reeve and its deputor. That cannot go unaddressed.
Jimapur closed his eyes and exhaled, as if in deep pain.
"You are mistaken, Cowboy Grak. The shire reeve, yeah, I killed him and had good reason to do so, but I didn't."
Amaryllis is requesting a visit,
Interrupted the disembodied robotic assistant, who was affecting a slight twang.
"Can I let her mosey on into town?"
Hold on, everybody. Put it on pause.
Said Fenn. No one changed position, except for J2, who sat down in the dirt.
Tell her that I am in the middle of Cowboy Grak 5. Say it exactly like that, and adamantly refuse to explain further if she asks what that means.
Fenn waited for a response. The wind whistled dramatically. Cowboy Grak stared stoically into the distance. Juniper, the elf ravager of legend, drew triangles into the dirt. A tumbleweed bounced off the slippery washboard abs of the town's cobbler, who reacted with a low, sexy grunt.
"She says that it's technically urgent,"
replied Prospector Glados.
"I don't know what she means by technically." "Yeehaw."
Fenn rolled her eyes. Urgency didn't really exist anymore, technical or not. Whoever said that Mary didn't have a flair for the dramatic.
Fine, let her in, but she needs to dress for the period, and she has to ride in on a horse from at least 5 miles out of town. My preference is for a sultry brothel, madame, but it's ladies' choice.
It took about 3 minutes for Amaryllis to appear as a dot in the horizon, and another 5 for her to make it into town. The devil on her shoulder wished that they had made the ride twice as long. The angel regretted not making it 4 times as long. Predictably, Amaryllis appeared riding a glistening red horse, with a whole Calamity Jane act going on, which Fenn had to admit worked much better than what had been suggested. She tipped her hat to Fenn, who swooned, not entirely in jest, as getting to see Amaryllis in a body was becoming an increasingly rare treat, falling in the waiting arms of several oily men. Mary looked over at Cowboy Grak.
"Howdy, thespian."
He nodded with a sniff.
Yeah,
Said Purgatorio Fenn, who had stood up and was wiping some of the oil off the poofy sleeves of their dress as she walked over to the horse.
I amplified the Grak levels to highlight the contrast with Cowboy. This guy sniffs 800% more than real Grak.
Cowboy Grak sniffed again to confirm. Mary looked around at the men, and then at Cthulhu, who was staring angrily at the ground.
"Him too?"
Obviously.
He said, without looking up from his sand drawings, as if offended by the question. She turned back to Fenn.
"Is this a sex thing?"
Asked Amaryllis.
No, it's Cowboy Grak 5. I had the real narrator with me for the first 4, but most of the appeal of Cowboy Grak was that I was the only one that was enjoying it, and that June was just being dragged along for the ride, but after the 3rd one he ended up getting almost more into it than I was, so I figured this time I'd use a thespian that was less willing to commit to the bit.
Footnote. Fenn is overstating both how initially resistant I was to Cowboy Grak and how much I was enjoying it by the end.
"So yes,
Amaryllis sighed.
it's a sex thing. The real narrator is with the kids?"
It was pointedly not a sex thing, but Fenn thought it was much funnier if Amaryllis thought that it was, so she didn't make an effort to correct her. She nodded.
Took them fishing or something. Can you believe the nerve of that man? Spending quality time with our children?
Good.
said Amaryllis. She started riding towards the saloon.
Let's go sit. We need to talk.
Purgatorio Fen split apart as they sat down in the booth farthest from the door, flanking Amaryllis with Fens on both sides across the table. It was still possible for them to hear Cowboy Grak's sniffing over the sound of the saloon pianist banging out anachronistic covers of bad J-pop songs. Actually, it was impossible not to hear the sniffing, because Fen had made it a feature of the town that regardless of where someone was standing, or what other sounds were present, or how far away CG was, it would always sound like it was coming from just a few feet away. There was no plot reason for it. Fen just thought it would annoy Thespijun. It did.
Sorry,
said Angel, breathing hard and wincing.
We've been training, but we can only maintain our fusion for a few hours.
Serious mode.
She saw their faces drop.
I know, sorry, it's about Solace.
The saloon pianist stopped playing one of the better Full Metal Alchemist openings, mid-key, at exactly that moment, since he had been programmed to do that whenever someone said anything even remotely dramatic inside the bar. Fen recombined and briefly considered ending the light dive, wondering if staying in the Wild West constituted a violation of serious mode, before deciding she didn't want to.
I'm telling you now, I'll only commit to 80% serious mode since you interrupted Cowboy Grak. Don't fight me on my 20.
The attempt at lightheartedness hardly helped. Solace's name brought up the kind of unpleasant feeling in Fen's stomach that Nellens once had, a mixture of regret and pity and helplessness. It was a kind of particular unpleasant feeling that there was probably a specific dwarven word for. Dwarves had many, many words for specific kinds of unpleasant feelings. One of Amaryllis's stranger hobbies in the heavens, very early on, was been going around and visiting many of those from Arab the party had antagonized, defeated, killed, intimidated, stolen from, humiliated, used or otherwise stepped on, deliberately or otherwise, in the path towards godhood. This was usually done with the intent to make amends or lend a listening ear, if so desired. Val had gone with her for most of these visits, which is how Fen first heard about them. She thought it was kind of dumb, but it had apparently been very productive in the case of at least a few people, namely Essuin and Hyacinth, both of whom had entered heaven with heavy resentment towards Amaryllis and an unwillingness to either talk to an assistant/thespian about it or have the obsession excised. There were a few people that Fen thought Amaryllis didn't need to be spending time with, one non-person in particular, but that was about the last argument Fen wanted to have, and Game Layer June had given his express approval to the project, so it wasn't her place to butt in anyway. Devil had considered getting the lingering resentment towards her, and several other people excised a few times, and did think she would eventually, but had yet to go through with it. Amaryllis had started with those she and the party had spent the most time with, or that she thought she could help the most by speaking with, and worked her way down, and it pretty quickly led to her scraping the absolute bottom of the barrel in terms of who was plot relevant. A 4-hour heart-to-heart with the tattoo mage from Baron Jewel, who tried extorting them, was both the highlight and low point of what Fen had been told about, which was apparently one of the last ones Amaryllis had done before mostly shelving the project. Solace had actually been the first that Amaryllis tried visiting, and apparently one of only a few to completely refuse to see her. As far as anyone knew, she was refusing to speak to anyone or even reveal where in the heavens she ended up, although that wasn't necessarily a cause for concern in itself. Amaryllis had taken it hard, or so Fen thought, with how much she brought it up, which, given what Amaryllis had done for her on Arab, wasn't terribly surprising. Fen had dealt with it by imagining Solace happy in her own private little druid world, with all the family and friends she'd known in her life before the Second Empire, singing to the trees and doing whatever mystic forest crap floated her boat, without all the pressures that came with being the sole remnant of an entire way of life. Fen and Solace hadn't spent too much time together on Arab, what with one or the other being dead for the majority of the adventure, but Solace had been, during a short life of hardship, one of the most pleasant, least judgmental people Fen had ever met. Interactions between them had never been tinged with any of the friction that Fen had at the time with almost everyone else in the party at one point or another. And generally speaking, she was just a cool lady. Whatever tension the party had with her had come after Fen's death. About 3 months after the world ended, a young Krantek came and visited Raven, and then others from the party. She was wondering if any of them had spoken to her mother since Herb. It came out that Solace had not been the one to petition to resurrect her own children, nor any of the druids serving her locus, even those very close to her, all of whom had been revived through other connections. It also came out that she was refusing to see all of them, too. Hearing about Solace not speaking to her kids actually endeared her more to Fen, in a weird way, because while everyone else in the party but Raven had become parents themselves by now, they could only relate to being parents in the heavens. It was less about any direct parallels to Fen's experiences, and more the assumption that Solace had at some point almost definitely experienced that unspeakably horrible uncertainty that came with being a parent as a mortal. Technically, Val was in that club as well, having had her kids during the time skip interim after June's death, although she hadn't raised them for more than a few years before the world ended. Solace must have known that constant feeling, always looming in the background, reminding you of just how badly you could screw over your kids in life, even while trying your hardest to do the opposite. Or maybe Fen was projecting, and druids didn't deal with that kind of self-doubt. Who was she to say? The self-imposed isolation, combined with what she had been like the last time any of them saw them before going to the long stairs, painted a more unpleasant picture of where Solace was mentally, but there was nothing to be done about it. Every once in a while, Amaryllis would send Solace another request to speak, or simply a letter to be answered, and they would be refused. Her children and friends continued to confirm the same happening on their end. All they knew was that she hadn't successfully petitioned for her own death, since she was making the effort of individually marking her refusals to respond instead of simply leaving the messages unacknowledged or having assistants do it. But that was all they had to work with. Solace had not spoken to any of them, and possibly anyone, for the last 15 years.
I have been speaking to Solace for the last 15 years,
said Amaryllis. The pianist, who had blown his load on the previous, much less revelatory revelation, stopped playing mid-key for the second time in 30 seconds, which noticeably lessened the effect.
Bruh,
said Fen. She had originally started using that word because her children had, but now said it long after he'd stopped. It really bothered them, along with most people, so it had become a staple of the lexicon.
Bruh. It was a lie by omission. Technically, I was always using language that never expressly denied my speaking to her, only implying it, and only because she made me swear to it as a condition to continue meeting with her. The only other person who knew was my Juniper.
Fen didn't even bothering trying to remember instances where Amaryllis had spoken about Solace, because she already trusted that it would match up with what she was saying. But she did recall a couple of instances when Game Juniper had mentioned that Solace was no longer a druid. She had interpreted it then as only educated speculation, but evidently it wasn't.
why do you... Well, forget it. What's she doing?
I don't know,
said Amaryllis.
I have good guesses, but nothing concrete. She withholds information from me. We have met under very precise conditions, under her instructions, about 20 times. We always meet in the same middle heaven, an empty coffee shop where she tells me to meet her alone, created just for the purpose. She refuses to talk about her children, the druids, the locusts, Erb, the heavens, her plans, where she's currently living or how she's spending her time, or essentially talk about herself at all. She always brings a list with her, questions, hundreds of them, and I answer them all one by one to the best of my ability. As soon as we are finished, she immediately leaves.
What kind of questions?
Cowboy Grak let out an implausibly loud and aggressive sniff, about 30 seconds long, and about halfway through, Thespian Juntang began screaming from outside for it to stop. Amaryllis closed her eyes and gently pursed her lips at the noise as she waited for it to end, but didn't ask for Fen to stop it, which they both knew she could have done with a thought. the almighty 20%.
Until recently, mostly nothing that in theory she couldn't get from an assistant. Almost exclusively questions relating to our time in Erb, or just Erb in general, very specific ones, often relating to details that I certainly wouldn't remember without my memory augmentations.
Fen raised an eyebrow.
Such as?
Most commonly questions pertaining to the specifics of magic systems, frequently about edge cases in regards to interactions between various magics and pseudo-magics and entads. Often things I had difficulty giving her precise answers on without being to consult any references, even with complete memories. A lot of questions about spirit magic in particular, about the Tung, the workings of Angelson government, the personal histories of the party members and many of the people we interacted with, the game layer, exclusion zones, Juniper, the DM, the Pantheon, the Metapantheon. Occasionally, hypothetical questions about what I would have done in certain extremely specific scenarios. In the last 2 years, the last 4 times we've met, more than half the questions have been about you. The most recent meeting, they were all about you.
Fen's shared mind was boiling with questions, and more continued to pile up as Mary continued to speak, but she defaulted to the ones she'd wanted to ask first, instead of the ones provoked by the last thing she'd heard, which was historically good praxis when getting shanked with info dumps from Amaryllis or the Junes.
She explicitly told you she wasn't a druid anymore? Or is that an assumption you're making?
Mary shook her head.
No, but asking and receiving answers to most of these kinds of questions, ones that require systematic, detailed, materialist answers, it's fundamentally incompatible with being a druid, at least as they were on Erb. It's not just that she isn't listening and disregarding most of what I tell her, which is what a druid would typically do when surrounded by this kind of structured information, which they would never seek out like this anyway. She always takes notes as I answer. Very detailed notes, judging by how much she writes, from the glances I was able to steal of it. Pages and pages with everything expertly abbreviated.
She glanced down at the table.
Not unlike how I used to do it.
Fen waved her wrist.
Why not just refuse to answer her questions, unless she answered a few of yours?
I tried relatively early on,
said Amaryllis.
She held out for 2 years, and I caved. I thought it would be more beneficial for her to have some contact. She appreciates, or appears to have some use for the information or the time spent with me, but I don't know if she necessarily views it as a need. I think she could go without it, whatever her purposes are.
Fen stared idly through the saloon's window, facing the street, as Amaryllis spoke, although she was still listening carefully.
But you said you had a theory?
Only too likely enough to be worth mentioning. It's possible that Solace has migrated to the highest heavens, and aside from conversations with me, is spending all her time there. Conventions of causality and reasoning can often apply there in a way that isn't really comprehensible to anyone who isn't currently among them, so if that is the case, there's no point in having a discussion speculating further about it. Her reasons would be undecipherable to us. It's completely possible to retain feelings like spite and bitterness in the highest heavens, so it could be that this entire exercise is some bizarre social revenge plot, as constructed by her patterned self, to make me feel bad.
People who went into the highest heavens were said to be patterned, a term that carried either very positive or negative connotations, depending on who you asked. Mary had been the only one in the party thus far to seriously dip her toes into the highest heavens, spending a few non-consecutive weeks there, which she had likened to her time with the Schlossvolk. When asked about it, she would hem and haw about the futility of describing it with what Fen saw as a kind of unconscious snootiness. She said that while she eventually expected to end up there in the long term, for now she was comfortable spending untold eons where she was, with her family. Though she still did like to bring it up in conversation a lot, usually in a way that made Fen think that she didn't realize how often she was doing it. Fen's personal opinion of the high heavens was informed by the fact that basically all of the elves that she had grown up with had elected to go there almost immediately after the world ended. That said it all.
The other, which is more actionable, is that she's writing some type of book. With her having lived through the worst of the Second Empire, it makes sense that she would end up being a staunch traditionalist. I can see her in a very low heaven, not trusting the assistants, not really believing in druidism anymore, needing to gather information for this project of hers, coming to me not because of any sense of affection, but because she wants a first-hand perspective of events she wasn't around for and wants to comment on. She would know I'm probably the only person who would indulge her in the very precise way she's asking to be indulged.
You think she's one of those people that thinks all resurrected people are clones?
Amaryllis nodded.
Probably, yes.
Which would have explained her not wanting to see her children or the other druids, Fen realized.
But why a book?
It felt like everyone but Fen had written a book, or in Val's case, a bunch of extremely esoteric fan fiction, or at least had one auto-written for them after a visit to the HHs. Amaryllis's Diet of the Hog Whose Fat Was Rendered to Make It, not a hit by any means, was a sociopathically long 56.9 million-word autobiography that described selected portions of the party's adventure, from Mary's POV, with the kind of detached, excruciating detail only found inside industrial technical manuals. In Mary's defense, it was only intended to be auto-read. Fen could imagine Solace wanting to quit druidism, but the idea of her pouring her time into something even remotely like that, especially non-automatically, which not even Mary had done, was very sad to her. It felt like too much of a betrayal of what Solace had once stood for.
Short of autotherapy or instant self-modification, or something effortless akin to that, I think writing, if you don't want to talk to anyone, and maybe even if you do, is the best way to examine yourself and work through personal issues. Written word has a kind of concreteness to it that forces you to lay out the reasoning for your ideals and thought processes, and that same concreteness allows you to challenge those concepts and improve on them. My reading of Solace is someone who, having not been able to indulge in it for a lifetime, greatly desires that kind of finely tuned self-reflection.
I mean, I can't disagree that writing helps some people, I guess.
Fen said, watching through the window, as Thespiarator banged his head repeatedly against a wooden post during another long sniff.
It just doesn't seem like her. Why are you telling me this now? Because she's asking about me?
Mary nodded again.
The questions were getting very personal. Not necessarily all information that I couldn't answer myself, but stuff I thought she'd be better off hearing from you. There were also, at the last meeting, among other things, many very detailed questions about your sexual preferences.
What?
Fen started to wonder if Mary, or June, was pulling a prank on her.
Are you a thespian? Was he that angry about being recast for Cowboy Grak?
No, I'm not a thespian,
said Amaryllis. She was unoffended by the question. That usually, especially when speaking to Fen, she was the one to ask.
Again, I honestly don't know what she's attempting, which is why I'm more inclined to assume she's in the highest heavens. Either way, I asked her at the start of the last meeting if I could mention this to you, which she was fine with, and then I suggested that she get into contact with you herself, which I think she will do. My request is that you humor her. Don't press her for information. Don't force her into talking about something she isn't ready for. Don't set conditions. If she is isolating herself in an unhealthy way, the primary goal is maintaining as much regular contact as possible, in the hopes that she will continue to expand her circle with time, or that she'll crave more than she is willing to ask us for and request help from an assistant. Based on how our last meeting went, I could see her trying to get in touch with you sometime in the next year.
Amaryllis was right. A few weeks later, a request came from Solace, asking Fen to meet her in the same private middle heaven where she had met Amaryllis. Fen, going against what Mary had suggested, and banking on the assumption that Solace liked Fen much more than her, a fact that she felt Mary might not be able to fully acknowledge, refused, instead sending her back a message stating that she would only meet her if it was at Solace's home, wherever that was, and that she wasn't allowed to be a bitch about it. Fen went back and forth on whether to keep the last bit in before she sent the message, but did, since it was the kind of thing that signaled that she wasn't just doing what Amaryllis was telling her to. She had expected pushback and a long wait, but Solace agreed the next day, and the day after that, Fen left to see her. Fen would have gone immediately, and she wanted to, truth be told, but she knew that in any negotiation, it was good to keep the other party waiting, and Solace agreeing as quickly as she did hinted that the offer wouldn't be retracted, simply because she didn't jump on it. Besides, she had something she needed to do first, something she hadn't done in a long time. Fen needed to reread Worth the Candle. To whet her appetite before she opened the real thing, Fen decided to begin with the bootleg. There were 2 versions of Worth the Candle available in the heavens, the mass-market edition and the publisher's copy. The publisher's copy was, in the simplest of terms, the real Worth the Candle. It was a mostly first-person 1.6 million word self-insert, lit RPG. Fen did not respect these words enough to allow them passage outside of quotations. Novel from the perspective of Herb Juniper, as written by narrator Juniper. He had once explained how that process between the 2 of them worked, which provoked a long monologue about how when people experienced thought in real life, they didn't actually think in full narratively satisfying sentences, although there were now heavens where people modified themselves so that actually that was the case. Ultimately, most of what narrator Juniper had really done was create a textual extrapolation based on Herb J's muddy thoughts, feelings, words, and actions on a moment-to-moment basis. There was also the all-important power of selection, the process of removing all of Juniper's personal experiences on Herb not relevant or interesting enough for print. He had shown her some of the Apocrypha once as a demonstration of the kind of stuff that hadn't made it in, which revealed a treasure trove of cut content. Best of all was the forbidden hot and steamy Grak chapter, which Neri stated he could not definitively prove happened or not in canon due to his permanent severance from the DM, which sounded like a cop-out if Fen had ever heard one. It was okay. Fen had read it 3 times, the last 2 of those times skimming right past any paragraph with the word narrative in it, and those couple of chapters that were like 90% numbers that felt like they were written by someone in a manic state, and a lot of the soul magic stuff, and all of the illusion magic segments, and some of the less interesting bumblefuck D&D group cutaways, and the Uther flashbacks during the Time Chamber arc, and a few more miscellaneous Mary logs in June's Plains, and a good chunk of the fawning over Mary, and a lot of the early Val interactions, and all of the Black Site stuff in the Angelson arc, and everything with Doris Finch and Blue in the Bottle, and a lot of the super gratuitous violence as a whole, which now rankled Fen much more after 5 kids and a decade and a half of paradise. Oh, and those gratuitous run-on sentences just listing shit. She always skipped those. Those were the worst. Had Fen not been porking the writer, she wasn't sure she would have made it through that many rereads, especially since the best character wasn't around for most of the book. Part of what made reading Worth the Candle fun, however, was the knowledge that she was one of the few people allowed to read it. Because of privacy concerns, the authority would only allow a small list of people to read Worth the Candle, 96 exactly. As of that point, the number grew over time, comprising only certain named characters from the book and a few of their friends and relatives, most of them very plot-relevant. Also a few who weren't, like Gemma, that fox lady with the anti-Uther group, and again, for some ungodly reason, the fucking tattoo mage from Baron Jewel. She asked the authority for its reasoning on that, and it said that even a hint about the explanation would have been enough to violate the privacy concerns, which sounded like some real Book of Job, I don't have to explain myself to you, bullshit to her. But other people did know that such a book existed, or at least that it could exist, because word did spread through the heavens, limited by certain concerns as it was. When people arrived in the heavens, they often wanted to know the meaning of life, and of the history of the last days of Ereb before the transition, and what caused the transition, and who, and how. And those questions invariably lead them back to Juniper. And the assistant would answer some of those questions, but would not answer them all, citing privacy issues. So, if a person asked an assistant for the best book that answered as many of these questions as possible, without breaking the privacy rules, while changing all the details that couldn't be repeated, And they didn't want to read Mary's book because it was less about the adventures the party had went on and more of a 60-million-word analysis of the mental state of close to every person she had ever met, that she had withheld a crapload of the juicy info from anyway, due to her own desire to respect certain people's privacy. And they wanted something less dry than a history textbook. They would get the mass-market edition of Worth the Candle. Was it historically accurate? No, but Fen wasn't embarrassed to say that she liked it better. As she reread it, she was reminded why. Fen still died, but not until 2/3 into the book, and under much cooler circumstances, via dragonfire as she dove headfirst into the boundless pit. Fen's father was avenged, which, given the lack of true vengeance in the heavens, kicked ass. Almost everybody had different names, most of which were so awful and non-indicative of their original characters that they weren't even funny to list out, except for Grak, who was Rocky IV. The addition of the marvelous moving mansion, to replace other more unpleasant features of the plot. Ropey became a full party member after accidentally making contact with a potion that increased sentience and granted a soul to any Entad, becoming a high-strung rope woman with constant mood swings, character bio's description, not Fen's, and her second favorite character. In-story Fen had Val knit her a shirt that said, "Not thought." Only 4,000 hells, which still sucked, but not as much. A Christmas special, an Easter special, and a completely nonsensical single-chapter crossover with Buffy, the Vampire Slayer, clearly written from the perspective of someone who either barely knew anything about the show or who hadn't seen it in decades. Val had apparently really liked this aspect of it, and had gone on to write her own, equally non-canon, alternate timeline Christmas special fanfic, which was based very directly on this one. 6/7 progress on the most important quest, all consensual, with absolutely none of that tasteful fade-to-black bullshit, Val being the odd one out, and Ropey having by far the best sex scene. It wasn't even close. Reimer and Maddie were both the opposite gender, which meant that Raven was a femme. Reimer ex-spy instead of a Maddie ex-spy, which, despite Fen's initial doubts, wildly improved the story. A lot more really shitty MCU-level dialogue, which did lapse back and forth across the hypothetical line designating where irony began and ended. Cottrell plus F for, "He's right behind me, isn't he?" brought up 12 results, not including variants for different pronouns, although half of those were from the Buffy chapter. Greg. The arc where Juniper went to study at an Athenaeum was expanded, he went to Claws and Clocks instead, into 3 different connected arcs, and a time skip where he joined the Arab equivalent of a frat during his lost year, and got into all sorts of wacky shenanigans as he struggled against his temporal arch-nemesis, the totally uncool Dean Wymie. The time skip started with the second meeting with the DM, who paused the game, scratched a literal record player, which started playing Baba O'Reilly, and said, "Yeah, that naked guy whose soul is trapped outside his body, in the bathtub filled with sawdust, bound and gagged by a pregnant rope, surrounded by 20 clones of Figaro Finch pointing void pistols at him, that's you? You might be wondering how you got into this mess." Rocky IV's clan had never died, and he only left Darili Irid because his father had banned all dancing. It was Rocky IV's dream to be a dancer, so his entire character quest was just going back home and having the party do a footloose. An escalating 3-way prank war between Fen, Ropey, and Palita, which Fen won because she had drawn up a will explaining the importance of everyone taking turns sitting in a special elven mourning chair during her funeral, which was a regular chair that she had connected to an entid that made farting noises when it detected pre-selected souls. Plane of Coxark. Okay, just 2 chapters, but girthy ones. The inclusion of Fen's favorite chapter, a really long Mary POV describing her journey to retrieve Pallada's hat from the stomach of a giant squid living at the bottom of the ocean. As soon as Pallada got the hat back, she destroyed it in front of Mary and said it was a prank to see if she would actually do it, which Fen fucking loved, because the joke relied on the book subverting the extremely specific minor detail that the real Pallada actually did care about the hat. And there were maybe 2 or 3 people in all the heavens who would have had both the necessary context and sense of humor to fully appreciate the bit. Fen also just liked hats and hat-related plots in general. On that note, they did cornflowers, the exclusion that was just a hat. It honestly dragged a lot, but at the end, the locust ate it, and that was funny. Rocky IV sniffed a lot more than canon, not Cowboy Grak levels, obviously, but about as much as you could squeeze in without it getting into crackfic territory. Dabbing was a way of communicating and raising objections within the Anglesey High Court, and the precise angle of the dab held drastically different meanings. There was one angle, only like 2 degrees removed from the most basic greeting, that was the Second Empire equivalent of a Nazi salute, so Juniper ended up having to go to what was basically a Zoomer cotillion class, because he couldn't stop accidentally doing the secret Nazi dab. There was constant, very unclever, really unnecessary foreshadowing about the candle June found in the long stairs. It had a mouth, was described as having the voice of somebody doing a middling impression of the guy who voices the cop on Family Guy, and screamed after they lit it. The last pre-epilogue lines in the book had Amaryllis shrugging towards June as Patwick Waxburton shrieked and saying,
"Well, I suppose this really wasn't worth the candle, was it?"
and everyone doing a long, slow-to-build end-of-episode sitcom laugh. Fen could have auto-read it, but she preferred the feeling of setting herself to be able to take in 1,800-plus words per minute and having her eyes just fly down a massive page of text. And some of the lowest heavens did have restrictions on knowledge you could take with you as you entered, if you had auto-learned it. It was much lighter than the publisher's copy, both literally, at about 925,000 words, so a little over half as long, although Fen was reading a digital copy, so actually not literally in this specific instance, and in tone. Both for the same reason, being that Juniper and Amaryllis's tendency to overanalyze had been severely cut down, or it at least wasn't shown as much to the reader. It was written in the third person. It was still there, but dramatically abridged, and gone were many of the discussions regarding the narrative. Juniper made it 3 arcs in before even revealing the game layer to the rest of the party. It was less cynical, and much less honest than the original had been, which in a strange way Fen found more honest, although that probably said more about herself than it did either book. It did not have Solace. Fen thought that was unfair, because basically every other change had been to lighten the story, either by removing sadder elements or not lending as much focus to them. And she didn't associate her with the same kind of fun-sucking misery that most the other excised stuff carried. It had definitely kept much darker stuff in. For example, replacing her function in the story was Nerad, a dark druid, and the last remaining, as Solace had been, who had apparently survived the Second Empire by successfully fusing elements of imperial ideology with traditional druidic principles. This, combined with the bottle, actually succeeded as a method to indefinitely preserve the locust's lifespan with comparable strength to what it possessed during its heyday, even with just the one druid, but at the cost of causing the locust great pain and the need to feed it the raw souls of sufficiently curious people. Nerad was a bland, one-arc villain who the group defeated to free the locusts, which then thrust them into basically the same situation as they had been in when Solace died, except with even less info to go on. Juniper had ended up having to become a druid himself to prevent it from dying off in the short term. It said something about how the Authority viewed Solace, at least within the context of the story, when it seemed to think that the locust being explicitly tortured for hundreds of years was less of a downer than Solace being present in the background. Being charitable, maybe that meant that a mustache-twirling Saturday morning cartoon villain like Nerad wasn't as sad as the last survivor of an otherwise successful genocide in a work that treated that with the level of seriousness it warranted. When it came time to read the publisher's copy, instead of going over and reading everything, she just had an assistant glue together every passage with any instance of either Solace or the locust, and read only them, chronologically. It was a strange way of working through it, but it wasn't at all incoherent. Going through it all at once with no breather, especially regarding Solace's arc, did get heavier than she remembered. A large part of that were the pretty frequent allusions to her having barely survived the Second Empire, which were more impactful because of the way she would mention it when she did, usually so offhandedly that it hurt to read. Her last real on-screen appearance was the talk Juniper and Amaryllis had with her late into the story. She was alone, miserable, and scarred from dragonfire on the Isle of Poran, mostly forsaken by the locusts that would only be dependent on her for a few more chapters. The book didn't mention the last time that Fen had spoken to Solace, 3 years after that, shortly after the Hell's Arc, before the second try at getting to Uther. It made sense that it didn't, because there weren't many non-Juniper POV chapters in the publisher's copy anyway, and it would have been a strange one, especially so late in the climax, but it was something that had stuck inside Fen's mind. There was only one chapter describing the interval between Hell and round number 2, one of those goopy time for one-on-ones with everybody in the party chapter, a sort of final victory lap to show off all the social progress Juniper had made during the game. Solace apparently didn't warrant a real mention, probably because there wasn't anything there that could have been called a victory. But there had been a few hours between the time chamber talks before the final assault, and the small part of the planning sessions that had to be done outside of the time chamber, and Devil had used it to visit Solace. It honestly wasn't enough to write about, even if June had been there for it. Just a sad, uncharacteristically quiet woman going through the motions of life, her role in the story extinguished. She was still a druid, and still living within the locust's boundaries, but Fen did notice that it was the only time she had ever spoken to her for an extended period without the locust making an appearance. At the time, she had chalked that up to the locust once again having other druids to interact with again, but with later context, it felt like they were avoiding each other. She still had the burns then, 3 years after they had been inflicted. Fen had dominated the conversation, trying to toss out as much comic relief energy as she could to cheer her up, but it hadn't done much. After that, they watched about half of Pocahontas together at Fen's insistence before Solace asked her if they could finish it later, which seemed like a polite Solace way of telling her to fuck off. It wasn't a pleasant memory to end their relationship with, but all Fen could do at the time was leave and comfort herself with the notion that they'd both be either dead or in heaven within the week. Overall, the partial reread hadn't given her any new context, aside from one detail, which she only noticed when skimming over some of the early stuff one last time before finishing. The implications hadn't fully occurred to Fen then, or on any of the rereads up until the last one, that Solace had said to Amaryllis upon their first meeting that she could hear everything that happened within the domain, down to the last whisper. The leaves told her everything. Juniper had fucked the locust for 14 hours. Fen knew because the text after they fucked said that he woke up some hours later, and one of Fen's favorite hobbies was bothering the narrator for his word of God about stupid details like this. It had been a difficult piece of information to extract, but some, in this case, meant 14, and later referred not to the point at which he fell asleep, but the moment they began copulating. That was canon, that was undeniable fact. He fucked the magic deer god for 14 hours and then fell asleep for 30 minutes. You never would have gotten that impression from reading the main text, which had certainly been intentional on the part of the author. But yes, 14 hours. 14 hours. Again, canon. She had engaged 100% serious mode to ensure that it was the absolute truth. She had made him repeat it 9 times and swear on their children's eternal lives. Those 2 words were the kind of dumb detail that latched onto Fen's mind like a cancerous leech, and that she would repeat until it wasn't funny anymore, and then long after that, more than enough to make the narrator regret that he had ever told her about it. Fen understood that on some deep symbolic level, it was about the union between unrestricted creativity and ordered systemization, and about the boundless joy and beauty that could come about when those elements weren't in conflict with each other, but also on an even deeper level, it was about a guy who fucked a deer. Fen's reading of the text began to evolve. There was Solace, near the end of the Worth the Candle, spiritually at her lowest. Her face burned, her leg crippled. The literal representation of her own cherished ideology, which she had spent centuries and multiple excruciating lifetimes trying to preserve, much of it alone, which she had been willing and ready to die for, which she literally already had died for, was shunning her very presence, to the point of intentionally denying her healing, despite knowing she was in great pain. And then the one true God's magical 18-year-old OC visited and explained to her why she was actually wrong about the religion she'd been practicing for 4 centuries, the same religion that he'd spent a lot of time not so subtly disrespecting, and she grit her teeth and listened, and earnestly admitted that she might have been wrong. She didn't know what to do, but she would keep trying to find the right answer. She admitted fault, and genuinely tried to consider his view, to be open to change, even one that bordered on eroding the most foundational concepts of what she had been fighting to preserve. And then, not much later, she listened to the one true God's most special OC talk to the locusts, because she had heard every conversation the two of them had ever had, save for the few when she'd been dead, and this one was no different. It implied with a snort, knowing she could hear it, that it hated her. And then God's most special OC used his special OC magic to call up another one of God's special OCs, the literal demigod of long, miserable technical arguments. And they had a long, miserable technical argument about the nature of the locust, one that arguably spat in the face of the very meaning of Druidism. And they didn't bother to pause time, so she heard all of it. And maybe she was skeptical. Maybe she knew it couldn't work. Because it was a fundamentally non-Druidic answer to the problem, because long, miserable technical arguments were not what Druids did. And then, against every inclination she had, it did work. It worked, not as another stopgap, not like she imagined it would be, but better, shattering boundaries she wasn't even comprehending as boundaries. He just argued about the rules and ran through the woods as a stag for a few minutes, and that was all it took. With her connection to the grove, even severed as it was, she would have been able to tell as soon as it happened. And then they fucked. Not because they needed to, but because they could. And the locust was happier than it had ever been in hundreds of years, and no tasteful cut to black, because this was something Solace had to live through. They fucked for 14 hours.
Footnote: 14 hours.
Her central purpose for living gone, her one goal finally accomplished more, in spite of her input, than because of it. Solace listened to her own philosophy get literally creampied by its living antithesis for 14 hours straight. Who wouldn't snap after that? There was a large cluster of partially connected heavens, everyone either called the low mids or the high lows, which by their very existence drew attention to the fact that it was impossible to objectively rank the heavens or sort them into neat categories. Unless you were one of those cranks who redefined objective to mean whatever the authority thinks, which was the kind of thinking that even the authority itself tended to disencourage. The Arabian hells had a simple ranking system, determined not by how terrible they were, but by the speed and efficacy of the hell's inherent healing factor, which increased the further down one went. As a natural corollary, that also increased how terrible it got, since more effective healing generally meant more effective torture. The devils apparently had gone through something not unlike evolution, in that the ones near the spots with more potential for better torture grew in strength over time, which explained why they also got smarter and stronger as one descended.
Footnote: this is not how the hells work. Fen taught herself how to have factually inaccurate internal dialogues to mess with me.
Heaven was not so simple, in particular, at the bridge between middle and low, which was made up of a lot of people who wanted a few specific aspects of the middles and highs, but not any of the others. It was typical for thespians, for example, to be allowed in the mid/high lows, but only to fill positions in society that were absolutely necessary for it to function. A thespian could play a boring NPC shopkeeper, but not an oily, muscle-bound oil salesman with a tragic, muscle-related backstory. Many of these kinds of heavens were very desolate, but they came together to form a large cluster, since the biggest pull of the low heavens was social in nature, and it was common for people to travel and communicate between them with less restrictions than were allowed at most other instances of discrepancy. Solace's home was highly populated, at 7.8 million, making it one of the largest in the cluster. It was also one of the higher heavens in the cluster, meaning that it had a great amount of specific allowances than usual. Context-dependent assistance, access to a limited amount of high-origin art, instant body modding, heavy earth influence, to the point where the heaven was more of an earth with Urbian influence, teleportation, and something called a two-threaded half-dive. Fen spent some time teleporting around the most populated city, Rush, where more than half of everyone, and Solace, lived, which kind of reminded Fen of the grittier sections of former small Soviet state cities, and Silmar City, a little bit. Although she was never sure whether or not things reminded her of Silmar City because she'd spent so long there. The air being as clean as it was created a weird dissonance with the dirty urban aesthetic it was obviously going for. It felt like the kind of blighted city that a person who had never been to an actual blighted city would have come up with. It was notably desolate, aside from the Spions, who all had green glowing diamonds above their heads to signal that they were NPCs, so people could know without asking. Fen walked around for about an hour among what were supposed to be the main streets, and saw only 3 real people, none of whom made eye contact. There were an absurd amount of broken-down, overturned cars on the sides of the road. Solace lived in one of the most blight-covered areas of town, in the penthouse of an ugly, otherwise empty 4-floor tower overlooking 2 empty parking lots and an abandoned suburb, although it had probably never actually been occupied. It seemed like about the last place in the universe that a druid would want to live, which Fen supposed was probably the point. Fen felt an odd pang of nostalgia as she rode the shitty elevator to the top. Once there, she knocked on the door and was soon face to face with Orang Solace. 18 years later, 15 of those spent in the heavens, and Solace had still kept the scars from the burns Parasev had given her. She was leaning on a cane and was noticeably aged, her body looking about 80. It was much more than made sense, since she was physically about Juniper's age right before the end of the world, so even if she had wanted to age normally, she wouldn't look that old. Meaning that it was a choice. Mary had elected not to tell Fen about any of this, which had definitely also been intentional. But even without body control buffs, Fen was good at controlling her facial reactions in these types of situations. She'd practiced that a lot during life, having been on the other side of it, with people taking quick glances of her elf/human features and subtly reacting, and she managed not to look surprised. Maybe Amaryllis thought that Fen would come across as less coached or influenced by her if she looked shocked. Fen grinned and held up a VHS tape. Solace looked at it and returned a smaller smile. Pocahontas.
I actually went back and finished it a few years ago while going through most of the Disney catalog,
said Solace, in lieu of a hello. Her voice had a creak to it that Fen hadn't remembered being there before.
Not one of my favorites.
Which did you like the most?
If Fen had known about either Fantasia movie when visiting Solace back during that last meeting on Herb, she probably would have gone with that instead. Solace blinked slowly, seeming to genuinely consider the question.
Lilo and Stitch, please come in.
Fen filed away the joke about Bambi's mom she had half-formulated in her brain for later, and slowly stepped inside. The interior felt like it could have been the apartment of any regular old lady on Herb, adorned with slightly more wooden furniture than might have been typical. Fen caught a quick glance of a simple, watercolor painting that was probably meant to be Solace, standing next to her children in a meadow. She noticed Solace watching her take it in. They took a seat in the living room, and Solace gave Fen a bubbly drink, which she expected to be some exotic herbal tea, but ended up being 7-Up. She took a sip and watched as Solace moved a few pillows around before sitting down on a recliner diagonal to her, moving slowly, still with a cane. Instead of her iconic cloak of leaves, she wore baggy mom jeans and a tan pullover, both very plain, more functional than aesthetic. Not that you had to choose between the two in heaven. This was, Fen reminded herself again, all a choice that Solace was making, either as a performance for Fen or for her own weird personal reasons. Having a visibly elderly appearance in many heavens was seen as tacky by a lot of people, in the same way that wearing an overly fancy outfit to a casual event might have been on herb. But even when people did that, it was almost always only on a visual level. The way Solace was grunting and moving made it clear that it wasn't the case with her.
So?
Said Fen.
Amaryllis thinks you're either writing an encyclopedia or pulling an incomprehensible prank on her. At this point, I'm leaning more towards giant pity party myself. Which, I totally get. People sleep on pity parties, but they're fun, especially when you have so much quality misery to work with.
Solace leaned back to look at the ceiling, gently gripped the sides of her seat, and smiled again.
Not too far off, I think. I missed you.
Have you spoken to anybody else other than Mary and us?
Solace shook her head.
Not real conversations. No. One-sided ones. I'd hardly consider my meetings with her to have been real discussions either. Transactions would be the better word, which is my fault, not hers. I didn't allow them to become anything else.
Then who else are you having the one-sided ones with? Assistants? Thespians?
Another shake of the head.
No, I don't like interacting with them. Not when they're acting as real people. Not what I meant. Hard to explain. Did you not look up information about this heaven before you arrived?
Was I supposed to?
Asked Fen. Fen took a long swig of her soda. Juniper called it pop, and obviously she needed to be a contrarian about it.
Okay then. Well, we have a few different packages on offer. First, I can stick with being comic relief Fen, and we can fuck around with unrelated side bullshit, slowly melting your frozen heart until you have a cathartic emotional breakthrough.
Pass,
said Solace.
Or you can get serious Fen, who confesses her whole life story to you in the hopes that...
You already did,
interrupted Solace. It was true. Another long heart-to-heart, not recorded in either version of WTC because June hadn't been there for it. Not as in-depth as, say, the heaviest letter she'd written to him, but not very far from it.
I remember it had endeared you to me a lot at the time. There's an old druid joke about druids never having the right timing for when to share sad stories about themselves. You probably would have made for an excellent druid. You have the right attitude, the flexibility. Very important that, if you could pull back the tendency to get stuck on the same joke.
You still consider yourself a druid?
No,
replied Solace, with what Fen took as extreme detachment.
I don't.
She sniffed, not out of sadness, but just to take a deep breath. And Fen reflexively smirked and smothered a snort in her throat.
Not laughing at what you said,
said Fen, speaking quickly.
You sniffed. Private Cowboy Grak joke, you know how it is.
Solace nodded again at that, with no hint of having taken any offense, which was one of those little things Fen loved about Solace, and which was apparently still the case, that she would accept the most batshit explanations on face value and instantly roll with it. It was a trait that the Wood Elves liked to say they possessed, an ability to flawlessly, effortlessly adapt to wildly changing circumstances without flinching or losing their composure. But it wasn't actually true, because their whole community had been organized around squashing anything truly surprising or different, so it didn't have to be dealt with at all. So in actuality, they were just very good at dealing with the narrow set of situations their default society allowed for. Such was the inherent contradiction of most elves, who both loathed change and viewed themselves as too perfect to ever be inconvenienced by it. Solace wasn't like that. She was the real deal.
I think Amaryllis saw this as a scheme. She sees the world in schemes. Maybe you do too. I should tell you that it's not. I don't completely understand why I chose to speak to her the way I did, or why I invited you now instead of later or earlier. Just the whims of a tired old woman.
Fen smiled.
So the questions were bullshit? You were asking her what got me off to fuck with her? Quality prank, I will say.
Solace looked into Fen's eyes, as if trying to decide something.
No, there was a reason. I recognize that this isn't a healthy way to live in this kind of isolation. I don't enjoy it. It's not something I'm going to stick with for the long term. But
you don't think other people in the heavens are truly real?
Finished Fen, gearing up for the debate. It was a pretty common epistemological issue in the heavens, along with the infamous, "Don't you see that this is all a trick by the devils to fatten us up with joy for the slaughter?" There were good arguments against these kinds of fears, but they usually stemmed from a kind of paranoia that didn't respond well to logical debate, so the best thing to do was excise them. Unfortunately, Solace was unlikely to do that. This kind of debate was a job for Amaryllis, or an assistant, or at least a lesser June, but Fen would suffer through it if she had to. Solace looked puzzled.
no,
Then why not?
my children are druids.
Said Solace. Fen raised an eyebrow.
And now you hate that so much that you won't even see them?
No,
Said Solace.
all 8 of my children are druids. That's not ordinary. Druidism isn't generational. It's almost the opposite. There's an emphasis, or there was, at least, on fresh blood for new inductees, a desire for diversity of species, class, personality, origin. Someone born into a druidic group wasn't usually allowed to pledge themselves to the same locus as their parents, not without leaving and journeying for enough time to be considered Ixa Von, a new person, and even then it was often discouraged. That all my children became druids, and that several of them were able to circumvent that ceremony and do so anyway. Following the locus's return to power, I re-examined and saw it as a failure of mine, that I must have exerted, without meaning to, the same kind of unconscious pressure on them that I had also exerted on the locus. When we came here, I thought it better to give them time to exist without my influence before reintroducing myself into their lives. I saw the effect of my existence on others as damaging.
I'm hoping that your use of the past tense is because you realized how fucking dumb that is.
Said Fen. Solace nodded.
I was in a very bad state when the world ended, and that persisted for some time. Still does, somewhat. I carried a lot of resentment towards myself, towards the locus, towards both my former ideals and my inability to live up to them, towards Juniper and Amaryllis, towards the dungeon master. A lot of that resentment, I think, has merit, and I'm not rid of it, but it isn't consuming me like it was then. In hindsight, I recognize that their becoming druids was much more a factor of the times we were living in, when the rules were even more pliable than normal, as was required by the circumstances.
So, if you have the emotional intelligence to know all that, let's just watch a few shitty movies and then go reintroduce you back into society.
Solace smiled.
I will, at some point soon, but I need to finish something first. Part of me continuing to remain alone has been inertia, but mostly, since coming here, there's something I'm trying to accomplish. I gave myself a goal, and I don't want to leave until it's done.
Say no more.
Said Fen, standing up and stretching. She had expected this eventuality and appreciated the symmetry it had to events on Arab.
Listen, my preference is that you age yourself down a few decades and heal the burns. That's less of a visual thing than it is an emotional thing. I'm not that superficial. But I won't force you. Although you at least need to make it so that I won't, crush your bones. I'm happy to reciprocate if you want anything changed on my end. Tell me, what are your feelings on coconut oil?
Solace stared at her.
Don't worry about narrator, we have an understanding. Not counting thespians, we each have a list.
Later, sure,
said Solace. And Fen was equally pleased and disappointed by the interruption, happy that Solace was DTF, sad that she didn't get to talk about the list.
But that's not what I mean. It'll be easier to show you. More fun anyway.
She walked Fen over to the door, farthest from the entrance, which Fen had assumed was a closet, but ended up being a parlor room, small and practical. It was dark, and took Fen's eyes a moment to adjust enough to make out a television, a snug lounge chair, and 4 large trophies, all silver, resting on a shelf adjoined to the back wall. Fen walked over to the one closest to the door, a silver bust in the shape of a rotting fist bursting from the ground.
That one's for Necrolaborium Tycoon,
said Solace.
the second most recent edition. It's even less tasteful than it sounds. Before that,
She pointed to the others.
Dwarven Bastille, Pikmin 2 Minecraft.
She made a little smile and patted the creeper's head.
That's how I got started. Still my favorite.
Fen's jaw dropped as she swiveled her head from one trophy to another.
It's crappy outside on purpose, so it feels better to be inside by comparison, because everybody's staying in doing this shit.
Her eyes widened.
Oh my fucking gods, don't tell me!
Hoisted above the 4 smaller trophies was another, in silver, mounted to the wall, the graven image of a massive candle with 3 wicks. There were 2 lines of thick inscriptions carved into the base.
Second place OSMAS any percent, worth the candle. 8 days, 1 hour, 55 minutes, 34 seconds.
Bruh.
Achievement unlocked. Tutorial complete. Achievement unlocked. Gotta go fast. Achievement unlocked. No time to explain. Achievement unlocked. To shreds, you say.
It was exactly, down to the second, 2 hours into the run, that Solace's June had teleported out of the Risen Lands, which Fen couldn't believe she hadn't done on purpose to impress her. It was clear that Solace wasn't taking it very seriously, because she kept going out of her way to show weird tricks to Fen that seemed to have no real benefit, like non-lethally kick-flipping off members of the Color Riot during the fall from the plane and doing ollies and other tricks while riding the Soul skateboards. The loss of the Soul Cycle was one of the lamer changes from the mass market edition, which the game seemed to have been very faithfully recreated from. That last achievement, best as Fen could tell, was because Solace had gotten quills with a remotely detonated void bomb immediately after teleporting out, which had presumably really fucked him up. She was sitting down on the floor in front of TV. Her preference, the chair had been for Fen, and her hands were moving nonsensically across a mossy stone with a thick wire hooked into one end of it, with the wire connecting into, rather than a console hooked into the TV itself. There weren't any buttons on the stone. Solace had explained that it was just an aesthetic choice to represent a dive in which her mental thread was doubled, one staying in the real world, and the other controlling Juniper's body from a first-person POV while in the game. Multithreading apparently didn't work exactly the same way in the heaven as it did in the game, which she said got very confusing, since multithreading was a huge part of the leading strats and was required for competitive runners. Once she unlocked it in the game, she had to manage a split consciousness within a different kind of split consciousness. The screen had an overlay on it, not just June's game layer and HUD, but a second overlay over that, which had a timer, a list of the intended segments of the run, although they already weren't matching up to what Solace was doing, and a chat room in the bottom right corner. Fen had actually watched a few video game streams with her kids before, so she had seen a similar setup, although most often there was a view of the streamer too, which Solace had chosen not to do. She didn't talk over it either, unless you counted how she was speaking as June in-game, but she wasn't breaking character there. The game showed what was happening from a first-person POV, and it was either being stabilized in a way that prevented spectators from getting dizzy, or there was a perceptive altering adjustment to the heaven with the same effect. It was more like the perspective from a first-person game than literally seeing through someone's eyes, since it didn't portray his blinking or any other similar minutia. Fen couldn't keep herself from glancing back over at the chat every now and then. There were around 1,100 viewers, although you wouldn't have guessed that by how glacially slow the chat was, which suggested to her that most of the people watching it had it on in the background.
Factualizer. Okay. I've been working on this hypothetical exploit, where you tell Mary that she's a character in a video game, but promise that you'll beg the authority to instantiate a real version of her, if she does what you say. But even with Max Sock and Devil assistance, she won't listen. Factualizer. Any good way to convince Mary she has no qualia? She's being so stubborn about this.
Ham Kronos. It's actually easier than you might think to do that with Grak if you do it at the right point in the game. particularly via Valencia, but it gets depressing. No point to it.
Wolf. No real reason to with Amaryllis either, right? Convincing her that you'll be able to revive everyone once you win, and that most subjective experiences above a certain threshold of suffering don't actually exist, via thespians, not simulation theory, can get her to drop more or less any moral qualm.
Factualizer. I mean, it would be funny.
Grimy. Didn't thank the pilot during the fall. The run is dead.
Factualizer. It's not a real run, just practice.
Grimy. You know, sometimes I go into a room with a bunch of thespians and have them laugh at my lazy Fortnite jokes, and that's almost enough to quench the void that subsists in me. Grimy, they never criticize.
Prod me can I get some emotes in chat for my boy Alman?
Ham Kronos, emotes.
Wolf, emotes.
Lament Froyo, I live to emotes.
Plug Chauffeur, emotes.
Kraken, emotes show me the precious metals, emotes.
Factualizer. Emotes.
Prod me can. Time to go gold digging. Prod me can for that Almanacy.
Fen couldn't imagine why Solace didn't count this as real conversation.
Wait,
said Fen.
I just realized, why are they using our real names if this is the fake version? Both the chat and the game?
Word filter, only on our end,
said Solace.
It's on the level of our perception, not the game. The timer on the screen is actually very slightly off from matching the game we see because of it.
Fen looked away from the game and at Solace, who was staring intently on the screen in focus, as if she wasn't simultaneously seeing it more clearly from Juniper's eyes. She still wasn't used to having Solace so directly answer questions like she was. Fen realized she had said our real names, even though Solace presumably wasn't in the game, if it really was true to the mass market version. Would Solace have preferred that?
So, this isn't the way you would normally do it.
No,
said Solace.
I was just taking an older conventional route to get to Caer Laga. Usually, you talk the guard on the plane into dropping you into one of the more dangerous exclusion zones and go from there. But it involves a lot of tricks that I don't think would be fun to watch without context. Caer Laga is where the game typically starts to open up in the traditional runs, and from there I thought I would show you some of the more intuitive stuff. I know you can't stay for a whole run, but I can, at least—
Oh, fuck off,
said Angel. She rolled her eyes.
Don't pretend you don't know what you're doing. Crafty old bitch,
said Devil.
Thinks we're that gullible.
Solace looked away from the screen to see that the Fens had split themselves. Angel looked her in the eyes and slowly tipped over the Pikmin trophy, which made the little Pikmin death screech when it hit the ground. She said nothing and kept playing.
I mean, honestly,
said Devil.
The only two people you decide to speak to in the last 15 years are Mary and I, who are, coincidentally, the only people you know who happen to love splitting themselves up into multiple people. I don't know at what point in the process you decided this, but you wanted somebody you knew you could trust, probably from the party, who was willing to have a version of them spend, is the goal here to get first place once, or to maintain that?
Once,
mumbled Solace.
I used to have the record. I just need to get it back once.
And how long will that take?
Asked Devil.
I think at this point a single-digit number of years,
said Solace.
Spend a single-digit number of years watching you play a bad video game. You already know that we're the perfect candidate. You realized at some point that Mary wasn't going to work for this, but you didn't stop talking to her. Then later, Angel and Devil came up in conversation. I assume the sex questions were Fenbait, to make sure we'd show up. Total Fenbait,
said Angel.
It was Fenbait, yes,
conceded Solace.
But it was also a legitimate question in the context of the run.
Bullshit,
said both Fens. Solace shrugged.
There are constants in the plot of every run. Events that happen regardless of actions taken by the player. These constants tend to be the biggest obstacles to getting a run's time down. One of them is your death. People have theories about how that problem might be solved. Granted, that solution—
Look,
said Angel.
We're fine spending an inordinate amount of time away from our young children and loving husband and fields of oily men to help you deal with this post-life crisis in the least efficient way possible. But
Angel paused and looked at Devil. They realized she hadn't needed the conjunction.
But,
said Solace. Said Angel.
I think that's it. You could have just asked. No conditions.
She turned to Devil.
You want to flip a coin to see who goes first? Let's go by number of arrows shot into Uther Pendraig,
said Devil.
I'm no good at counting, so you'll have to help me out. Let's see. For me, there was that one, you know, in the long stairs. Solace. The first thing you should know about her is that she has one joke. One. Every time Purgatorio says something that's actually funny, it's me. What Devil really shot that day was her sense of humor.
Angel started towards the door.
You can have it. It's clear you don't have anything else. I'll be back to switch off in 10 days.
Devil cupped her hands to her mouth as Angel closed the door behind her.
Lot of talk for a bitch without an arrow.
She sat back down on the chair next to Solace.
I only say that because she's a bitch without an arrow.
15 years of separation had created a lot of natural differences between the Fens, although they had much more overlap when discussing herb or coming up with elaborate ways to annoy people, which were generally the times when they'd present as Purgatorio. In order to make her existence more tolerable, Purgatorio retained no knowledge of the arrow.
Self-deprecation is a blade that should not be wielded lightly,
said Solace, who had mastered the art of frictionless code switching between gamer and wise old forest sorceress.
Neither is an arrow? Not that she'd know anything about that.
She stretched out and put her feet up on the overturned Pikmin statue, and was a little disappointed that it didn't make the noise again.
So, you said you had the record before? What makes getting it again so important, if you already had it once? Don't worry about explaining everything twice. We'll merge memories whenever we switch turns.
Solace shot Game Fen in the heart with a void pistol and turned the screen off. Fen looked at Solace.
Should I not have asked?
No, it isn't that,
said Solace.
The chat just likes it when I shoot you.
Oh.
There was more than enough of a visual difference between Fen's game XP and how she actually used to look on Herb that it didn't feel anything like watching herself getting killed, but it still was odd. Solace smiled.
Just because people like watching you getting shot in the head doesn't mean you aren't very popular.
Solace began mashing her fingers against the stone in a way that made it clear that it was still only a symbolic gesture. A new interface popped up on the screen, although it only showed a simple timer. The timer started, but the rest of the screen remained black. There was no game, no sound, no chat, and no video of the player. Fen smiled.
I've heard of blind speedrunning, but this is...
Watch,
said Solace. The timer continued to go up. 1 minute passed. Nothing else changed.
That actually wasn't completely a joke. That's what I thought it was,
said Fen.
If not, I don't get it.
Assistant,
said Solace.
Please show footage of what is happening in the game.
That permission has been denied by the player.
The assistant's voice was Solace's own. Solace laid her head down on the floor.
On Earth, the requirement of needing to verify a speedrun by releasing a recording of it naturally made it a social activity. People would watch runs done by others, sometimes to cheer them on, sometimes as entertainment, sometimes to learn what they did and try to build on it for their own attempts at the record. But since we have the perfectly impartial tendrils of the authority to rely on, it is not necessary to actually show anyone the footage of the run to prove that it happened.
So people break records with submissions that nobody else can watch?
No. One person breaks records with submissions that nobody else can watch.
Without getting up, Solace again mashed her hands on the rock, and the timer on the screen was replaced with text.
Multi-thread assisted speedrun, any percent worth the candle. First, the Reaper, 5 days, 16 hours, 4 minutes, 39 seconds. Second, OS, 8 days, 1 hour, 55 minutes, 34 seconds. Third, Saul, Elevator Facts, Redford, 19 days, 11 hours, 10 minutes, 44 seconds. Fourth, Lanterns, O-Lanterns, 19 days, 21 hours, 33 minutes, 18 seconds. Fifth, Apex Lex, 21 days, 14 hours, 52 minutes, 46 seconds.
As the list went further down, the gaps between runs shrank, until by the late 60s, they were separated by only a few minutes. Solace waved her hand at the other trophies around in the room.
Those used to be gold, all now silver, courtesy of the Reaper.
Are they targeting you?
Asked Fen.
Somebody you know?
No,
said Solace.
They have records in the leading categories for more than 200 games, and they only touch anything with active communities, so those are competitive, difficult categories. They come out of nowhere, submit a single run that nobody can watch, and move on to another one.
Do they come back to snatch up the record if someone takes it back?
No one ever has taken a record back,
said Solace.
Whenever they do this, they don't improve it by a little. They improve it by so much that nobody can even start to figure out how they did it. My time for the 100% Pikmin 2 run is 3 hours, 11 minutes. The person behind me is 3 hours, 13 minutes. The Reaper did it in an hour, and that's an exclusively glitchless category. Most of the runs they do are. When this started, it used to be motivational for other people who were playing a game, because it rallied everyone together in the name of beating a common enemy. But it's gone on so long without anyone even getting close that now when it happens to a game, it kills off most of the community surrounding it. Some have made new categories that require you to post the footage, but it's mostly not taken seriously. It's hard not to view it as a consolation. Even a couple of years ago, this heaven used to have many more people in it.
Shit,
said Fen.
Maybe it's a group working together under the same name?
Not according to the authority,
said Solace.
Also not enhancements, clones, or patterns. Not allowed. The most like explanation is that the Reaper is just very good at playing video games.
Solace sat back up.
But I can beat them. 3 days seems like a giant gap between us. But proportionally, compared to what they usually submit, it's not much. When they submitted that 5-day record, I was at 9 days. I went through every other game they ran, and other than that, they've never submitted anything that wasn't at least twice as fast as the old record. I don't think that's a coincidence. The ratio is only that small because they couldn't get it lower. I can't see the way forward with the other games, but with Worth the Candle, I can.
Fen smiled.
Gods, the more you talk, the more you sound like Juniper.
I don't know what I am anymore,
said Solace, slipping back into a tone more like the one she'd had when Fen had first come into the apartment, which made her regret making the comment.
I don't enjoy thinking about the world from a druidic perspective anymore, and I don't enjoy thinking about it in the way that Juniper and Amaryllis do either. But I find that I can't help myself. Too much time spent with the zealots at both ends has warped me away from moderation. Habit pulls me towards the extremes.
Don't pout,
said Devil.
That's how you end up with so many wrinkles. Like I said, you have the comic relief Fen therapy package, and I couldn't have picked better unrelated side bullshit if I tried, so you're in good hands. Now pick up the rock and start over. We must reach the Almanacy by first light.
Fen had expected the novelty of watching Rocky IV and his father floss in unison to wear off after seeing it 20 or 30 times across different runs, but it had actually become tired after the first time she saw it. She'd already seen Cowboy Grak do his share of flossing during Cowboy Grak 3, What, in the Nation of Tar. She didn't let her disappointment get in the way of brainstorming.
Unicorn bones for grinding, you could...
No,
said Solace.
The run timer counts subjective experience as time. The bones are great for fights, obviously, but in an ideal run you aren't using them at all. Most of those sub-30-day runs close to me are people who have almost as much knowledge of the game as I do, but who can't stop relying on them as a crutch.
Time chamber or same problem?
Same problem,
answered Solace.
Spirit magic?
There technically was soul magic in the mass market edition, but so many use cases for it had been excluded prior to the start of the story that it was more like a child's toy by the time June got his hands on it. Spirit magic was slightly buffed up to make up for that, and it served a lot of the same function in the plot, but it was hardly the get-out-of-jail card that soul magic had been. One of Fenn's favorite running gags was Amaryllis learning more and more about how useful soul magic had been, prior to being excluded, and getting progressively angrier about the party not having access to it.
There are uses,
said Solace.
Not dramatic ones. Anti-memes are more prevalent in the MME than the original, so it mostly helps with that. It also provides in-game multi-threading, which is important.
Luck manipulation,
said Fenn.
Mass farming elf bones. Put us in the grinder. Put me in the grinder.
I know you said you read it, but I don't think you understand how the game works. You are making the mistake most do when they start running Worth the Candle. Let me put it like this. Fenn, how do you think runners take advantage of the level system?
It's a leading question, so we both know that whatever I'm going to say is wrong, but I assume you try to time it so that you level at specific times to take the most advantage of the healing. The game doesn't tell you how much experience enemies are actually worth, but you could figure it out by restarting the game over and over and killing different combinations of enemies to see how many it takes to level up. Good old-fashioned murder algebra.
We tried that,
said Solace, shaking her head.
There aren't any behind-the-scenes experience points. Numbers have nothing to do with it. You can only grind up to level 3 by mass-killing generic enemies. And after that, the game only levels you up when you kill an arc boss or complete a major quest, and neither of those are ever guaranteed. Levels are only an artistic representation of progress.
Oh, so this is a narrative conversation,
said Fenn.
It'll be tricky, but let me see if I can think of a topic I want to talk about less.
No,
said Solace.
It's not narrative, it's meta-narrative.
Fenn grinned.
Oh, you found one?
Worth the Candle doesn't want to be speedran, and it won't allow one to skip the elements of the narrative that it deems crucial,
said Solace.
It knows that the player isn't actually Juniper, but it doesn't care, and it won't adapt or customize the experience to match them. It's not necessary for certain events to transpire as they did in the novel, with some exceptions, but it is necessary for the themes, lessons, and self-reflections those events symbolize to be represented in some other way.
Fenn rolled her eyes.
Solace, I'm being easy on you because I know you've been through a lot, and because I'm eventually hoping to get an easy lay out of this. But I refuse to listen to more narrative lectures about Worth the Candle. It's not happening.
She stretched.
Show me cool video game tricks, talk about your feelings, lay on the ancient druid anecdotes, whatever, I'm here for it. But if you start going on about themes and degenerate cycles...
All I mean is that the game is non-intuitive,
said Solace.
The fastest route is never the shortest one, and it's never the path that avoids strife, because the game cheats and won't allow for that. It doesn't matter if you come in knowing all the secrets. You can't brute force your way to the end by boosting luck and throwing yourself towards the long stairs, no matter how many resets, because whether luck succeeds is based on the whims of the game and an internal dungeon master, not a numerical value. For example, with leveling up, I found out that you can guarantee a level up by killing a boss in front of enough people who don't know about the game layer and Juniper's powers, because them knowing about it creates a new problem to deal with, and the game loves solutions to problems that are ultimately destined to become even larger problems. You can't outsmart Worth the Candle by avoiding pain. You can only manipulate how it is dealt, and how quickly.
Just so long as Juniper is in pain,
said Fenn, smiling.
Okay, so if elf bones are out, clearly I need to pull out the big guns. Tree magic? Oh, it was a one-night stand. Me and other side Juniper,
said Fenn, who was staring at the ceiling instead of the screen.
Mostly just so I could say I did the whole trinity. Boone is, I don't know. I actually dislike him as a person. I think the feeling is mutual. It was very explicitly a box-ticking exercise We both liked the notches we were giving each other. That's enough for a one-time thing, but it's not happening again. I think my big issue with him is that he's very self-aware, but in a way that makes it feel like he's not self-aware at all. It's uncanny. Also, he really wanted me to be an octopus for a lot of it. Kept repeating the same joke about him being a pescatarian.
I can pretend that any of that is scandalous to me if you like,
said Solace.
But I've been to druid orgies.
Achievement progress, a key for 7 locks, 2 out of 7. Achievement unlocked, no strings attached.
Seems unfair that Ropey is the only one who gets her own achievement for it,
said Fen.
She's not. The mass market edition likes handing out achievements much more readily than the original did. Everyone has their own achievement having sex with them while fulfilling a specific condition. Yours is Elf on a Shelf, if you're curious. It's very loose with what it considers a shelf.
You read the original?
Fen knew that Solace was on the list of those who could, but she assumed that she wouldn't have done it.
A majority of it, and some of the supplementary stuff,
replied Solace.
I skipped most mentions of myself. I saw nothing to be gained by it.
Funny,
said Fen.
Right before I came to visit, I did the opposite.
She paused.
You know, for me that included the scenes where you were just a soul in a jar while we were trying to revive you, so I guess you didn't read that.
I did not,
said Solace. Ropey howled.
I don't want to sound like I'm going out of my way to defend her, but bleeding isn't the right word. Neither is screaming. They don't express how raw it was. The sound she made when she saw your soul, that's burned into my memory. I've listened to more than my fair share of people die protracted, violent deaths, yours included, and that's still the worst noise I've ever heard.
You both do that,
said Solace.
Calling it a she. It doesn't matter, I just find it strange.
I was honestly worried that it was going to, I don't know, die from sadness,
said Fen. She leaned back further in her seat.
Seemed like the kind of thing it might do.
Solace grunted.
It mourned whenever it lost a druid. Nothing special in my case.
Are you mad at it?
Asked Fen.
I know you said there was some resentment there. In the name of transparency, I should mention that I still hang out with the Locust a lot. Her heaven's fun.
The Locust's personal heaven was as pleasant and amorphous as the pro-patterning people always tried to make the higher heavens sound, without any of the pretentiousness. Everyone who visited appeared in the forms that the Locust imagined for them, usually varieties of magical forest animals. Raven famously hated it because it always made her an actual giant raven, claiming to be more offended by the laziness of it than anything else. Solace massaged one of her wrists.
They were common attitudes that potential inductees would need to overcome before they could join us. Mental barriers frequent enough that we had names for them. One, which was perhaps the most likely to cause someone to falter, was jusus mav. It was the tendency to define the nature of the relationship between oneself and the locus, and to unconsciously incorporate that definition into your interactions with it. To treat it as family, friend, lover, home, village, master, priest, temple, nation, god. It possesses traits of all these things, but it is none of them.
I know I've heard you call it your master before,
said Fen.
I have,
said Solace.
Jusus mav is a persisting attitude, not a momentary lapse in understanding. A long-lived druid will invariably find herself interacting with a locus in ways that draw comparisons to all of those kinds of relationships and others, and that is natural and good. What matters is maintaining the understanding that a locus is a locus, and only that, over time. Many cannot do this. It was not an official position, but I was considered a leader of my grove, and it fell to me to explain to struggling newcomers and potential inductees how to overcome this problem. It is a conversation I have had thousands of times.
And that's what you think caused your problems with it?
Solace shook her head.
No. My problem was the opposite. I defined the locus as a locus too much, and allowed room for nothing else to grow in the empty spaces of that definition. But I did experience gazemaize sharply at the very end of my life, because I found that it, leaving me to rot, did not feel like being betrayed by my locus. It felt like being betrayed by everything there was to be betrayed by.
Fen wanted to raise a polite objection to it, having been a betrayal, or at least one as intentional as she was framing it to be. But she found that she couldn't find a way to say that she didn't think Solace couldn't twist around. She even considered mentioning the tree, but Ropey said that she wanted to go for another round, and she decided that the timing wasn't the best for a rebuttal.
There's always been something intrinsically seductive to me about librarians,
said Xander, leaning a little closer to Raven.
I love a woman who can read me like a book. Oh, is that the stick you said you stole from Zinnia Pendraig? What's it do?
It just occurred to me,
said Fen.
This is the 10th full run I've seen you do, and Juniper hasn't gone to the bathroom once. Is not needing to do it in the game a quality of life feature, or are you having my husband shit his pants for a week straight? I think there's a rant in the Grak Apocrypha that talks about this.
There are different bathroom strats,
said Solace.
Some people hold it until they get druidism and then go in animal form while fighting or doing other tasks. Gold magic or certain entads can also be used to manually remove waste with telekinesis. Personally, I create 2 void catheters at the start of the game from pistols. It only takes a few seconds, and I don't need to look anymore while I modify them and do the insertion, so it's very easy to miss if you aren't looking for it. I can do it while riding the soul board. Doesn't cost me any time. Someone in my chat made one of those descending underwater iceberg charts for my runs, and I think the catheters were the deepest item.
Fen was frowning.
I think you might be too far gone, Solace. I can't work miracles.
You can get away with having him shit himself if you do high SOC runs,
muttered Solace.
Not that anyone does those.
If you have enough dexterity to stuff a gun in your dick while skateboarding, I don't know why you don't work on multitasking more while adjusting stats,
said Fen.
You leave a lot of time on the table with that.
Solace wasted about 3 hours staring into space each run, broken up into small, minute-long chunks, dispersed throughout the playthrough. Soul magic was said to put the user in a trance that made multitasking close to impossible, but the regular stat screen didn't. And Solace had already shown that she was more than capable of managing different complex tasks at the same time. It was an easy target for improvement. Fen could have brought it up earlier, but she hadn't wanted to accidentally provoke a long conversation about how the stat system worked.
I don't think I do,
said Solace.
If I can get it any faster, it's on the scale of milliseconds. I'm surprised you can see me doing it.
That's just not true,
said Fen, who was going to continue, but saw the stat screen appear on the television for the first time ever.
Wait, what? I can see it?
Fen had never actually seen the stat screen pop up before. She'd assumed that it was visible to Solace only.
So you've already been doing it that quickly this entire time, and I never realized because it was that fast?
The pauses aren't for fiddling with the menus,
said Solace, waving her hand.
It's for navel-gazing. My own discovery, although it's now the standard used by all. The game wants Juniper to come to various realizations about his behavior and interpersonal relationships, and it's going to force you to spend time having him come to those conclusions in one way or another. So you want to get out ahead of it and pick the way that's going to cause you the least grief. Take Juniper's tendency to gamify relationships with others. It is always going to be addressed, it's a constant, but you can address it yourself in advance and save time. If you stare into space with a sad expression for a couple minutes after a bad relevant conversation with someone in the party, and then change the behavior, the game will assume you had your daily meaningful Kansas flashback and learned the lesson, and that's going to prevent a much worse, much longer conversation later on, during a more dangerous and pivotal moment. This is as big of a deal as getting the rapid telepathy entads for the party as early as I do. It saves that much time.
But wouldn't the game know that you aren't actually thinking about it? Or are you actually having the flashbacks every time?
The game doesn't care about what you think, only what you do,
said Solace.
Remember that I'm choosing to play in the first person, but that's an option I toggled, not the default. It's based on the mass market edition, which is in the third person. If you play a convincing Juniper, that's enough to satisfy it. The reason you can't begin a new game and display all the desired behaviors from the start is because the game won't see that as genuine character change. It has to feel real. It will keep stifling your progress until it does.
So the game thinks that Juniper jamming a void pistol up his ass 10 minutes after starting is less out of character than him being slightly less of an asshole?
Solace smiled.
Oh, not just the game.
Loyalty increased. Ropey level 26. Quest complete. Cutting the cord. You have ventured to the Goat Coast and untangled the mystery of what happened to Ropey's creator and first wielder. The silver-hoofed queen may be long gone, but you have brought closure to her story and in doing so untied Ropey from the burdens of her history. The bitter memories that have tightly bound the eternal golden woman to the past have been loosened, and her full strength now lies before you unconstricted. She will not forget what you have done for her. Companion, passive unlocked, the peculiarities. All living beings contain within them, Ropey. The peculiarities all living beings contain within them. Ropey is now a meta-entad, capable of pulling others into targeted forge frenzies. With limitations to quality and quantity of the entads, she can rope them into creating. Entads forged through this process are also strongly affected by the nature, ability, willingness, and condition of both Ropey and those she pulls on. All created entads must conform to the standards of the entadic two-dimensional bound matrix. In addition, the Lasso of Truth passive can now be activated with only momentary physical touch and lasts 1d12 hours starting from the point of last contact. Level up.
This one breaks the whole game,
said Solace.
Not as much as she did, especially in normal play, but in terms of running, once you learn how to abuse it, it's a godsend. The game is happy to exclude magics from Juniper, but it will do just about anything to avoid having to exclude a party member, even partially. So the passives are very powerful. If you start going overboard with overusing any party member except Amaryllis, it will just manufacture a crisis, so they leave the party for an arc or two, usually very transparently, which starts to be funny once you notice the pattern.
Fen was staring at the quest text in awe.
The wordplay feels so much worse than I remember.
Solace blinked.
Oh, yes. I usually don't need to read the text anymore, thankfully.
To be clear,
said Fen.
I consider that a good thing.
Solace performatively turned away from the game to look at Fen.
That the puns suck?
She nodded.
You know, I was so relieved when my kids started to hate them. They're so like him. In every other sense, I see it in these tiny details. The way they move and process the world and the kinds of questions they ask, and that's beautiful. I love it. I love them. But I wanted them to hate puns. I didn't want them to get that from us. I really, really didn't. I know it's not supposed to do anything unless you petition it directly, but I actually prayed about it a few times when they were little. I don't think it did anything. It's probably all upbringing, but they despise them. It's great. I get to torture them every day with it. They completely loathe me every other time I open my mouth, and they can't do shit about it because I'm their mom and they fucking love me. I love a captive audience.
Fen had been actively trying to avoid talking about her kids, other than in passing, but suddenly let the impulse rule her. She hoped Solace didn't take it as a strategic move, which it wasn't intended as. She just had a lot of mom anecdotes that she liked sharing. Such was the curse of parenting. Solace hit her with a sweet old lady smile.
What's the worst one you've ever done?
So, this was with Ficus Frips, Devil's first daughter. I only mean with the birth when I say that, for both sets were equal mothers with everything else. She's one of Raven's readers, always has a book in her hand. At the time, she was getting into all these comics, and one of her younger brothers, Shiaticus.
Footnote. No, we didn't name our son fucking Shiaticus. Angel and Devil have a joke. where they lie to people about having given our children absurdly terrible names. When they laugh or ask them if they're being serious, they pretend to get offended and start crying or calling them racist. I have been begging them to stop doing this for years. Obviously, she was never going to get any reaction out of a former druid with this routine, since the last thing they give a shit about is societal naming conventions. I don't know whether she forgot that before she started or knew and decided to go with it anyway.
Was teasing her for it. We don't discipline him for doing it. It's very gentle, good-natured teasing, and there's enough of an age gap between them that she feels mature by not being bothered by it. But eventually, I decided that he's going to suffer a bit for being a little shit. So one day I stop in the higher heavens and get one of Val's herb fanfictions auto-adapted into a manga and bring it home. Big picture of a dwarf holding an axe on the front and back. I sit in the living room next to Ficus Frips. She's also reading one of hers, and I start reading mine as conspicuously as I can. Sure enough, not much later, little Shia comes around, says he can't believe I'm reading one of those lame comics too.
Solace closed her eyes.
And then you said, "Comic? This isn't a comic, it's a Grakfic novel."
Fen was beaming.
I had to repeat it 3 times since he didn't hear me right on the first 2, and I started to worry that he didn't have enough context to get it, but when it hit him, wow. Didn't speak to me for 2 days. Even his sister was mad about it. The contempt for me really brought the 2 of them together.
She wiped away an invisible tear. Solace set the stone down, not that it was a serious run anyway, and looked into Fen's eyes.
"Are you a thespian?"
"Yes,"
said Fen, nodding once.
"I've been doing local community theater for years, never any speaking roles, but I was just cast in our local production of Company, and I think this might just be my big break."
There was a surprisingly complex set of rules about the exact ways that a thespian could or couldn't answer the question while remaining in character. So Fen's snark was less ambiguous than it sounded. Solace went still for a moment, scratched her neck, and then picked the stone back up.
"You feel like a much more extreme version of yourself. Time, I suppose."
"That's what's great about heaven,"
said Fen.
"You don't have to stay in character, and if you do, you can just completely Flanderize yourself." Valencia once told me that when she writes fan fiction, her favorite thing to do is to set up the plot years after the original story has already happened, because then nobody can accuse you of getting the characters wrong.
"They can accuse you of laziness,"
said Solace.
"The line between genius and laziness is as thin as a fine lean bowstring, my dear Solace. If someone can't appreciate that, you pull it back and aim to kill."
"This was a huge discovery,"
said Solace. She pointed at the screen as the Herald Thargox hybrid tore through the Mecha Doris.
"At the time, it shaved about 14 hours from my PB."
"Nice,"
said Fen. Elf luck, by and large, didn't exist in the heavens, and Fen occasionally missed that little euphoric feeling of her instincts pulling her towards or away from a certain action. At that moment, there was a jolt in her head and a feeling of heightened awareness, and it wasn't elf luck, but it was the closest thing she had experienced to it since Erb, outside of some nostalgia-laden deep dives. It screamed at her not to say another fucking word. It was tough, but she managed to listen.
"Wait,"
said Devil.
"I always forget. Does the run officially stop when all the wicks burn out, or when it starts screaming?"
"As soon as you light the 3rd,
said Solace.
"And that's time."
40 minutes down,
said Fen.
"Good shit, 2 records in a row. You want to take a break, or—"
Solace had put the controller down and was staring idly at the wall.
"Thinking about something?"
"Oh, just ruminating,"
said Solace. She swallowed the last of her leaves.
"Could you fetch more, please? And some chips."
Fen grabbed the empty bowl and started walking to the kitchen.
"Mesquite or hickory?"
"Either is fine."
As Fen was about to round the corner, she heard a hissing noise that was incongruously loud compared to the game volume, and poked her head back in the room to see what it was. It was coming from the creeper statue. Solace brushed her hand against it, and it stopped.
"I have an alarm that goes off whenever somebody next to me in the rankings passes me,"
said Solace.
"Not only Minecraft, the Creeper Trophy does it for all of the games." Probably Necrolaborum Tycoon. The third place guy on that has been getting closer to me for a while. He came up with this new system of biopneumatic tubes that's simple enough for the zombie mothers to assemble while they're in labor. And since all the parts for the earlier models were already sourcing materials from the babies.
Wouldn't the trophy have turned bronze?
Asked Fen.
Not necessarily,
said Solace, who turned to look at the zombie statue.
It also rings when the person above or below me widens or closes a gap.
She frowned and paused the game, and switched over to look at the Necrolaborum Tycoon rankings, which flashed on the screen for only a moment before disappearing.
Hasn't changed?
She mumbled. The menus immediately switched again to a different ranking, and this time, Solace let the list linger on the screen.
Multi-thread assisted speedrun any percent worth the candle. First, The Reaper, 3 days, 6 hours, 14 minutes, 0 seconds. Second, OS, 6 days, 6 hours, 40 minutes, 54 seconds. Third, Saul, Elevator Facts. Redford, 19 days, 11 hours, 10 minutes, 42 seconds. Fourth, Lanterns, Lanterns, 19 days, 20 hours, 10 minutes, 53 seconds. Fifth, Did Somebody Say Fireball? 21 days, 13 hours, 30 minutes, 27 seconds.
Fuck,
said Fen.
They put that in as soon as you were done with the last one. Is someone allowed to hold on to an old run and wait to submit it?
Yes,
said Solace. Her voice was meeker than it had been before.
They've done this a couple of times before to others, and I was expecting it, but not with a gap that wide.
She made a fist.
That probably isn't their fastest one.
How do you know?
Because there's a joke in the community about counting runs in measurements of the runtime of holes, and that's exactly how long it takes to watch holes 40 times.
Solace laid her head on the floor.
You know, when I joined the Druids, I was taught a spell that stripped me of the need to hibernate. Sleeping the winter away is not suited to the lifestyle of a Druid. Contrary to stereotypes, most Crantecs led very strict and traditionalist lifestyles in most ways that are substantive. Outsiders drew misleading assumptions about the entire culture because of the nudity. In all my time, I have only met a handful of other Crantec Druids other than my children, and most of those came from backgrounds in imperial cities, not our racial enclaves. I think something about the obligation to seasonally hibernate inherently breeds traditionalism and a distrust of outsiders into a group. Perhaps it's the cold, or the need to rely on others, or the strictness and careful planning it requires the entire community to undertake.
I'm sorry,
said Fen.
I don't see the connection.
There is none,
said Solace.
If nothing else, I admire Juniper's ability to cope with adversity by summoning purposeless exposition. It does little for me.
She sighed.
Please bring me my leaves.
Fen did, and when Solace didn't reach for the bowl she'd put out next to her, she began to drop leaves in her mouth from the air, watching them flutter lazily down into Solace's open mouth.
You should try them,
said Solace, a droplet of sage-colored cud sliding down her cheek.
Even with the restrictions in this heaven on how good food can taste, they're much better than anything I ever had on Erb. I think whoever defined the restrictions here didn't extend them to apply to the foliage.
I think we're operating from opposing ends of the food chain,
said Fen.
But you know, if you want me to try eating something green...
Another point for you having Druid potential,
said Solace.
They always picked the strangest times to flirt.
Do you want to stop?
Asked Fen.
I don't mean take a break. I mean stop. You could go see your kids, your friends, travel, go on some dives, even if you don't want to excise anything about yourself. And I get how there's baggage there, what with the Authority and the Second Empire. I'm not asking you to do that. There's just more interesting things to do than this. Things that would make you happier.
I'm not offended at all if you want to leave,
said Solace.
It's been almost a year. I'm grateful for getting that.
If you were in a good place while you were doing this, and it was actually for fun, I wouldn't mind sitting in here for another century,
said Fen.
But that's not what this is.
Footnote. This was a few paragraphs ago, but I'm not over it. Why did Fen readily accept that Solace can instantly recognize multiples of the runtime of holes? That doesn't even earn a passing comment?
Other than the aesthetics of it, it's not very different from how it was for me when the world ended. Better, because I have something to work towards again.
Which, no offense, was also a shit situation. I do get it, more than I think you realize. Not including the breaks, I spent 15 years screwing around in the Risen Lands, and the entire time I had this goal. Well, I had different goals at different times, usually saving up some random amount of money or improving my skills as an archer in some vague, tenuous way. I was miserable, but because I always had the brief high of loot and arbitrary goals that I was working towards, even though those goals didn't really mean anything to me, it was easy to keep going.
It is one specific goal,
said Solace.
I take the record back once, in this specific category, and then I'm finished. The time commitment has grown with this, I admit.
It's more about the mindset that's driving the behavior than the specifics of it,
said Fen.
Mary's attitude would be not to push you, but I know if it was me, I would need the push. I didn't leave the Risen Lands because I reached one of the arbitrary goals I set for myself and finally felt satisfied and ready to move on with my life. I left because I got lucky and got wrapped up in the plot. If Juniper and Amaryllis never existed, and I'd escaped the fire team on my own, I'm sure I would have been back in the Risen Land within the month, if not sooner, and from there. I don't know. It's very plausible to me that I might have stayed in that pattern for another 15 years, might still be there now in that hypothetical world. Also, yes, you do have forever, but just because you do, it doesn't mean it's not a waste to spend the next 100 years doing something that you don't enjoy.
Fen dropped another few leaves.
I also don't want to push too hard or scare you, but there is a time-sensitive element to this. When I tried to contact Nellen, I decided from the start that if he didn't want me to be a part of his life, I would understand and accept that, but I wouldn't live with that pain. I would have given him time to change his mind, a lot of time, but if I did and he didn't, or if he made it clear that time wouldn't have been enough, I would have excised the part of me that cared. I haven't gotten rid of anything yet except jealousy, but I am sure I would have done that. I would have had to. Now, I spoke to your kids before I came here. They don't give me the impression that they've even considered that. And if they did do it, almost everyone who takes those kinds of measures puts safeguards into place that undo it if the other person ever makes a good faith effort to rekindle the relationship. But not everybody does. We've been in the heavens long enough for plenty of sad stories about this to start popping up. I don't want you to be one of them.
Solace swallowed again.
Are they still druids?
Yeah,
said Fen.
Diehards. Turns out that being martyred for an ideology makes for a really committed follower in the afterlife. Druidism as a whole is thriving and growing in the heavens, and not just because of resurrections, which is much more than most religions can say.
If they haven't wavered, I'm not worried,
said Solace.
I understand how they think about these things. Nux diem wala.
Oh, they said that too. What's it mean?
It doesn't matter,
said Solace.
They don't think it matters at all. Is it a nihilist thing like Hakuna Matata? Or is it just an expression, and it's like, Nux diem wala. It doesn't matter right now at this moment and is out of our control, so we should focus on the present.
I mean, it doesn't matter what it means,
said Solace.
The whole language is made up anyway.
All languages are made up,
said Fen.
Druidic is more made up,
said Solace.
There are no linguistic rules to follow, and nothing builds off anything else. Every word in a Grove's dialect of Druidic is called that, because a Druid thought it sounded right when they were coming up with it. Nobody learns to speak it naturally through immersion. The locus pumps the knowledge into you as you become more attuned with it. In my grove, the word for tree was ro. The word for trees was urezka patapiv.
Fen snorted.
Pluralization comes from the heart.
Solace pushed herself off her back, wiped the dried leaf juice from her lips, and picked up the stone.
So I really can't talk you out of this?
Krantech culture views life as a long series of seasons and stages to be progressed through and overcome, with effort and diligence. I have kept nothing else from those days, but I have never been able to completely shake that idea away, nor have I wanted to. It has been a comfort through hardship. This is something I want to do.
And you feel like you can get to a 3-day run without it taking 1,000 years?
The Reaper thinks I can, and they have the advantage of seeing how I play,
said Solace.
They wouldn't have gone through the effort of trying to demotivate me otherwise.
Don't know about that,
said Devil.
Angel's never going to get that arrow, but that doesn't stop me from bragging.
Obtaining pustule magic wasn't a major component of Solace's plans, but it did help her navigate through a few tricky underwater combat sections and procure some metagame benefits. And as she continued to whittle down her time, she kept switching back and forth every few runs on using it, or having skin magic, serve the same role. For the run they were on, she had gone with skin magic. Fen had cracked a joke about feeling relieved, which Solace had taken as an insult.
I have always found pustule magic to be a beautiful art,
said Solace.
Krantech biology is not suited for it, but had that not been the case, I would have practiced it myself. It was a popular secondary discipline among the Druids.
We're going to have to agree to disagree on this,
said Fen.
I understand that it is not in line with Imperial aesthetic sensibilities.
No, don't pull that shit,
said Fen.
I'm not shallow because I wouldn't want to spend my life riddled with pus for an ability on par with plenty of others without those drawbacks. I met a couple of pustule mages in prison. It's not just the way it looks. They had to spend time every morning draining discharge to keep magic earwigs from bursting out of their face. Not my idea of a good time, especially for something you can just as easily get from a bunch of temporary tattoos.
But it's not the same as skin magic at all,
said Solace.
Skin magic is about rote memorization of a rigidly defined system of inflexible rules. One studies and masters the act of manipulating the ink on the skin and copying the tattoos, and it is only personalized from how one applies the spells. Pustule magic is about turning yourself into a garden, to have everything you do and are, the food you eat, the air you breathe, the sun you take in, to manifest from within you and onto you as energy and power. It is a continuous process that requires awareness and maintenance of all aspects of the self.
I can see how that would appeal to you and a bunch of druids living in a post-beauty society, but...
We all had our personal preferences, like any other group of individuals. Druids see themselves as a part of nature, not separate from it, and certainly not above it.
Yes. But when you're living in a big imperial city or a small town full of racist assholes instead of an ideologically homogeneous commune in the woods, your appearance makes a big difference. When you're getting a raiding party together, when you're trying to make a guard look the other way after getting caught stealing food, when you're begging the old man at the corner store for medicine for your kid, you want to look good, especially if you're already starting off with a disadvantage.
Both Fens had multiple bodies that they wore on different days, and they all had stark differences, but all were half-elf. She pointed to her ears and teeth.
If this is the baseline, you can't afford another handicap. It sucks that it matters. Mattered back then, but it did. It's about survivability, not vanity. The day I was arrested wasn't the first time I was caught with contraband. It was the first time I was caught without makeup on.
I suppose it's just too hard for me to believe anyone would view having that face as a disadvantage,
said Solace.
That's not fair,
said Fen.
Using Druid Riz to win the argument is cheating.
Solace laughed.
You're too easy.
Warning. Greg exposure has exceeded 95% Greg threshold. Rerouting interpretative Greg functions via pseudo-cognitive reverse L systems. Greg network allowance reduction imminent. Lesser Mandelbrot, Gregling defeated. Lesser Mandelbrot, Gregling defeated. Greater Mandelbrot, Gregling defeated. Greater Vixek, Gregling defeated. Greater Vixek, Gregling defeated. Greater Sierpinski, Gregling defeated. Greater Sierpinski, Gregling defeated. Greg defeated. Achievement progress. Greg, negative infinity out of infinity skill increased. Greg, level Z sub n plus 1 equals Z sub n squared plus C quest. Complete. Greg, you have, through great sacrifice and ingenuity, brought what could be called an end to the hex within the hex. Maybe next time you'll be more careful when hanging around the edges of the map.
Greg,
said Solace, the disdain apparent in her voice. Fen nodded.
Greg.
Celestar had been one of Fen's big disappointments with the publisher's edition. Herb Juniper had mentioned that he'd visited it offhandedly when they were in the Hells, and she'd later imagined that as a lengthy arc-length adventure fraught with danger, requiring the entire party's skill set and a feat of engineering that made the glove plane at Caer Laga look like a party trick. Instead of that, Juniper had flown there with gold magic on a quick detour, used it as a storage closet, and immediately left. It would have been funny, in that major subversion of expectations way that Fen liked. Cowboy Grak 5, Yet Another Fistful of Obols, was actually about Cowboy Grak uncovering the tragic backstory of his sapient hat and had nothing to do with money at all. But she had built it up in her head in a certain way and was annoyed that it didn't live up to that. She had complained to narrator about it, and he had gone on rambling about why he thought Worth the Candle ended up not lingering on the elves or their culture, explaining that Juniper had never personally struggled much with a fear of imperfection, and that his relationship with her was, narratively, their most important contribution to the plot. His rant carried the suggestion that Fen was the best of all the elves, and she had demanded that he make the implicit more explicit, and then he went and made everything about the conversation explicit in other ways. All that to say, Fen thought she would be more interested in Celestar once Solace started experimenting with it in the search for new routes. But exploring revealed how little there was to build a plot from. The design of the place was an endless series of pristine, boring elf architecture, and perfection magic wasn't uniquely strong or interesting compared to a lot of other exclusions. The archwizards didn't even have the courtesy to monologue about elf philosophy, so the party could dunk on them with witty retorts. Thankfully, Solace hadn't spent too much time on the pink spot, and instead decided to try for a hypothetical exploit that had more to do with the origins of perfection magic, rather than the specific way it had been applied on Celestar. In the world of the mass-market edition, the first prototype of perfection magic had been discovered as a method of getting around star magic limitations by creating a system of lines around all of Celestar that controlled a massive amount of power without ever needing to be updated, as most larger star magic projects needed to be, but something had gone wrong in the attempt, as it had on the real Arab. Solace believed she finally understood what that problem was. The roof to Solace's apartment was open to let in the evening air. It had a sunroof, since Solace still occasionally missed the feeling of the sun on her skin, unveiling a lackluster night sky with about a handful of dim stars and a weak crescent moon. In Rush, that never changed. Unlike the self-effacing Earth moon, which underwent lunar cycles, Celestar had been frozen into a permanent waxing gibbous from the effects of perfection. There was a secret hidden sect of partite elves waiting to be confronted on the far end of the dark side, but that plot thread was even less interesting than the perfection mages, and Solace wasn't bothering with them either. Instead, she was thousands of miles away from the empty citadel, in a random crater that sat on the border of Celestar's Terminator line, the stark divider where the light met darkness. Solace was having Juniper carefully stretch and arrange hundreds of meters of ropey on and above the ground. She was the ideal tool for star magic, since a lot of the more complex and enduring possibilities were locked behind the major issue of the lines starting to fail, after the stars had changed position in relation to them, even on the micro level. Because Ropey could adjust herself precisely and continuously to follow along with the movement of the stars, it prolonged the length and power of the spells, and on a meta level, the game rewarded weirder and aesthetically unique applications of magic.
This shouldn't work,
said Fen.
So it probably will. I would loudly doubt you and offer to eat my cool hat upon your success. But alas, I have no such cool hat to consume.
I like to knit,
said Solace.
I could make you one. I think I could do it while playing.
Fen chuckled.
This would be a hat for eating, Solace. Obviously, I couldn't eat a gift hat.
Footnote. Fen likes the idea of getting a cool hat more than actually having one, because if she got a cool hat, then she wouldn't be able to complain about it. She is keenly aware of this dynamic and will go to absurd lengths to preserve the status quo. If you try giving Fen a hat as a gift, she will sob and ask you how long you have been ashamed of her ears, and if you try to be clever and present her with one that doesn't cover them up, she'll make fun of you for choosing a crappy hat. Ask me how I know.
Rhymer Raven was also with them, sitting and watching from atop the crater's edge. She was great, because she was the only party member that would readily engage with the idea that she didn't exist without getting super angsty about it, so Fen was always badgering Solace to include her more when they were messing around with the game. She was casually polishing a dragon's skull.
Amaryllis mentioned that the two of you spent a lot of time with her,
said Solace, who had just noticed the skull and had stopped in-game to look at it.
Regular Raven isn't as cool as Murder Hobo Raven,
said Fen.
And obviously Murder Hobo Raven can't be compared with her Cowboy Grak equivalent.
Footnote. An actual giant raven wearing a cowboy hat.
But we mingle now and then. We went on a few weekend dives last year when she was trying to get out of a rut after her breakup. I think we did 6 in total.
What were they about?
One was this weird puzzle-solving adventure,
said Fen.
It was based on Myst, old video game. You know it?
Solace shook her head. Some people made or shared pre-designed dives that had no custom elements. They were generally worse than the individualized, authority-driven experiences. But the appeal was in knowing you were doing the exact same thing as other people, and being able to talk about it with them afterwards. Fen had chosen a popular one without doing much research, not realizing that it didn't work well as a 2-player game until they had already started.
Not the kind of thing I think people would speedrun. I was cracking jokes while she did all the puzzles,
said Fen, sighing.
I got the feeling that she would have enjoyed it more if I wasn't there. Raven screwed up and earned us the bad ending. This guy was trapped in a book. It was a whole thing. She was pretty reluctant to do another, but I talked her into a buddy cop movie, and that's what clicked. I worked very hard to have it be fun for her to make up for how bad the first one was, made some big sacrifices. In our buddy cop dynamic, I played the straight man.
You?
Solace did one of her famous old lady chuckles.
I can't see it.
That's what she said when I offered,
said Fen.
I'll put it like this. She was the one who asked me to do all the sequels. I committed.
She sighed.
I liked it a lot more than Angel did.
I can see that she would be less suited to it,
said Solace. Devil scratched her chin.
You can?
You have different cadences,
said Solace.
Her jokes are more rapid. You prefer to build up to a bigger punchline over time. Your style is more adaptable to that role, I would think. The little differences between you two add up.
It's weird how we match up and don't,
said Devil.
You would think it's a linear thing, where we keep drifting further apart. But it's more like we go through periods where we are more like each other, and periods where we aren't. Like you said, it's those small differences, but big picture stuff crops up too. Angel wants another daughter soon. I'm fine with that, but I don't think I want to have another myself right now. I'm not rushing to get into a Grak situation.
Footnote. When Fen and Solace were having this conversation, Grak had 25 children. If I told you how many he has at the time of writing, you wouldn't believe me.
One more would be enough.
She mentioned that,
said Solace.
Is she waiting until you do?
Devil smiled.
Nah, she's just trying to come up with a name for her that's punny enough.
She pointed to the screen.
Speaking of puns,
Solace had Juniper mumble about how he didn't think it was going to work. Not because she felt the same way, but because it had already been proven that saying that made it more likely that it would. She could only get away with it a handful of times each run, and if the game ever thought the player or a party member was trying to openly gamify it, it would instantly stop working. Clearly, Solace was gamifying it, but the important thing was to not address that fact. In order to grant the game, the veneer of legitimacy it wanted. Game Amaryllis would inadvertently become a hindrance when it came to tricks like these, because she was great at noticing trends and trying to take advantage of them, not knowing about the meta-meta layer that kept them from working more than once. Ropey's star magic construction was finished, a three-dimensional building-sized maze of herself with thousands of different angles and bends in all directions. It activated. The Terminator line between light and darkness began to move. For a few seconds, the light pushed back the shrinking darkness until it stopped, a new border for all of Celestar settling only a short distance from the original spot. That had been enough. During the time the light had grown, the conditions were met, and the second effect of Ropey's construction had started. A portal opened. As Solace and Fen peered into it, they could see that it was the one they had been waiting for, the same portal that had stymied the work of the elves without them even knowing it. Solace had discovered the plane of wax. With enough experimentation, shortly after the first anniversary of Fen's visit, Solace discovered that it was possible to keep her alive for the entire game. The secret rule that governed the meta was not that Fen had to die, it was that whoever was serving as the party's primary comic relief character had to die, and that it couldn't be Juniper.
Footnote. This rule also applies to recurring allies of the party, which is what dooms Pallida.
The social gymnastics required to ply apart the sun-shaped Venn diagram of Fen and funniest person in the room conservatively added about 6 days to the run. Fen continued to perish. In the mass-market edition of Worth the Candle, Juniper became a druid after killing Nerad, and the game expected the player to follow the same path. Druidism wasn't as useful as it should have been for speedrunning purposes because of meta bullshit, but it was the most efficient way of keeping the Locus alive. The only other party member at that point in the game who had the willingness and capability to become a druid was Fen's XP, and that was only delaying the problem, since she always died later on. There were a few amenable NPCs that could fill the spot while appeasing the meta.
Footnote. Rattleclack, Pinot, Jorge, several other characters who don't have equivalents in the publisher's edition, and the tattoo mage from Baron Jewel.
Assuming that Juniper still spent the requisite time boosting the Locus's loyalty, but doing it that way, it extended the length of the run. Solace always became quieter when she had to put all of her focus into a druidism interaction, and not in a relaxed way. If she did speak, it was to complain.
It shouldn't have levels,
she mumbled. When Fen was in prison, the guards occasionally put on radio plays. During one of them, a prisoner who had been an accountant was stabbed because she wouldn't stop complaining about how inaccurate the financial details were. Fen would have related that story to Solace, accompanied by the appropriate wisecrack and threat of shanking. But Solace's history with druidism and the baggage that came with it was the one area she felt obliged to show restraint. But what had restraint done for Fen lately? After carefully weighing the pros and cons, she decided to open a dialogue.
Get over it already,
said Fen. Solace turned away from the screen and looked at her.
True druidic progression cannot be numericized. The game makes the effort to try and represent other aspects of it accurately, even if it mostly fails at that too. So I think it's fair to say that it should have been more consistent.
Not the levels?
Clarified Fen.
The other stuff. The destruction of your entire way of life, the hundreds of years of suffering, your friends and family being murdered, your God abandoning you to your plight. All that. You should get over it. I'm bored of waiting.
Solace cleared her throat.
It is easier said than done.
Maybe for you,
said Fen.
No disrespect, but you could be trying harder. Have you tried?
I will not submit to editing,
said Solace.
Who said anything about that?
Asked Fen.
I didn't. I'm saying that you, independently of the authority or anyone else, should spontaneously overcome all of your trauma through consummate force of will. Have a flashback or something. Go on. Have a flashback. Treat yourself, you deserve it. I deserve to hear it too, actually, so you should make it one of those shareable flashbacks.
It was as close as Fen had ever come to directly asking her about her past. It was gauche, in the way that digging for details in sad character backstories invariably had to be. It was the ambiguities and holes in a story that gave it power. An unspoken inference would always hit the hardest. For her own good, it had to be cheapened.
Do it,
said Fen.
Don't tell me you fell for that show don't tell crap. Tell.
To Fen's surprise, Solace told.
There was an exclusion that destroyed the social bonds between people. The Second Empire decided they wanted a new case study, and our grove was close. They stole many from us for experimentation. My children.
She paused.
I had the great misfortune of finding them again afterwards. The Second Empire tested the efficacy of that magic by offering its victims a paltry reward for the heads of their families.
Fen could tenuously identify a shred of similarity to that, and how it felt for her when she knew that Nellen was forgetting her and falling in love with a different family. But she knew better than to fall into the trap of comparison.
I'm so sorry.
Solace was as composed as she always was when talking about the Second Empire. Fen knew that Solace could cry. They had recently taken a break from the game because she wanted to read Fen the poem from the end of Minecraft, and she had needed to stop multiple times to wipe the tears from her eyes, but she had none to shed when it came to her own life. Fen thought back to her analysis of Solace's perspective near the end of Worth the Candle. Was it true that all Juniper had done to get the locust to open up was run in the woods as a stag? No, there had been more to it than that. He had talked to it. He had made a continuous effort to understand it and to change his assumptions about how it wanted to be treated as he learned more about what it was like. Once they had grown closer, he had even started calling it out on its shit. What did Solace need in order to heal? She didn't want to cry about it, and she didn't need someone to tell her that she was allowed to cry about it. There were people who did, and the Amaryllises and Valencias and Junipers of the worlds would be there for them. But Solace hadn't responded to that. That wasn't her problem. She was a 400-year-old occultist who shot down helicopters and pulled the bones from fresh corpses for armor. She didn't need a Mary or a Val, or their style of problem-solving. She had tried that. Solace had sensed what she'd actually required, which is why she had called on who she had. Solace needed someone to take the piss out of her.
Still,
continued Fen,
you should get over it. You don't need to do it all at once, but I would appreciate it if you could pick up the pace. If it'll help, I can bring another timer in here and you can treat it like a new game, like your speedrunning grief.
She cocked her head.
Not to be too glib, but since they killed all your children, would that be a 100% run?
I killed my children,
said Solace.
They got better,
said Fen. Silence hammered the room like a graceful doe, colliding against a windshield.
One paragraph about your snot-nosed kids dying does not a flashback make,
Fen explained.
When Grak first told Juniper about what happened to Darily Irid, that wasn't a flashback. That's the setup for the flashback that came later. I think it's the same as the game. You have to stare off into space to activate it.
Solace didn't reply.
Are you doing it?
Asked Fen, after another extended silence.
It might be easier if you pause the game. I don't want the multi-threading to detract from the authenticity of your filicidal rampage.
No,
said Solace. She continued to play, stone-faced.
You should have been a druid.
Fen stopped there. Solace's best individual segment times already added up to less than the record, so it was only a matter of time before she cinched it. If Solace hadn't been so close, Fen might have kept pushing and tried to get her to quit again. But it was easier to wait and see what happened next. Maybe the Reaper would one-up her again right before she took back the top spot, and then they could reevaluate, and maybe they wouldn't, and Solace would reach her goal. They would know soon. On the next run, Solace didn't once grumble about druidism. Soon after Solace submitted a run within an hour of the posted record, while they were still on break, she received a private message on Rush's streaming platform. Solace had never responded to any private messages before, and she rarely received them, so she checked it as soon as she heard the ping.
The Reaper, I wish to meet you in person. Is this possible?
They waited to see if there were any messages to follow that one up, but that was it.
Who do you think it is?
Asked Fen.
My top 3 guesses are the Layman, Vervain, and Sweet William.
Footnote. In real life, Dianthus Sweet William Pendraig, if you need a refresher, he was the representative the Draconic Confederacy sent to Mionun after Hyacinth told them about the party flying around with Bethel, is as kind-hearted as his epithet suggests, and his appearance in the mass-market edition is reduced to an offhand mention. In the game, his XP seems to be a straightforward copy, but if the player makes certain decisions in the Angle Sin arc, they can get pulled into a murder mystery side quest where he turns out to be a very unsympathetic serial killer. He's become something of a meme.
Maybe Parasev. That would be a neat callback. What about you?
I don't think it will be anyone we have ever met or heard of,
replied Solace. The roof was open again, this time during the day. It was getting close to noon. There wasn't a cloud in the sky.
Lame answer,
said Fen.
Don't go all realist on me, Solace.
She snapped her fingers.
Oh, I thought of a better guess. I'm not going to jinx it by saying it out loud, but I'm pretty sure I know. Do you have a pen or something? I'm going to write it down on my hand so you can't say that I'm lying about what my guess was later.
I would trust you,
said Solace.
You shouldn't,
said Fen. Solace nodded.
I shouldn't.
Without asking any questions, Solace sent the Reaper her address and invited them to visit. Seconds later, there was a knock on the door.
The teleportation, right?
Said Angel.
Should we greet them?
Solace nodded. She put her hands in front of her and gestured for Fen to help her stand. Fen laughed.
No way.
Please,
pleaded Solace, her voice soft.
No,
said Fen.
If you want, I'd be happy to make you something else to eat.
The last time Solace had asked Fen to bring her food, Devil had gone into the kitchen, spent 2 days preparing an elaborate vegetarian stew, and brought the entire pot to show Solace before throwing it out over the sunroof, where it fell 4 stories and repainted the parking lot. It was a massive struggle for Solace to make it on her feet by herself, and after slipping a few times, she managed to pull herself up by using the TV for support. After she caught her breath, she seemed to ponder her situation for a moment, and then closed her eyes. She made herself about 20 years younger, returning to her 60s.
The burns, too,
said Fen.
No,
said Solace.
I think they look alluring. I already took the sensitivity away a little while ago.
Fen smiled.
Just my luck. We have company for the first time ever, and that's when you finally decide to make your bones less crushable.
They walked to the door. Fen stood back as Solace went to open it.
If it's one of the junipers, I don't need to get the record anymore,
said Solace.
If it's narrator, I don't need to be married anymore,
said Fen. Solace opened the door as slowly as she could. Outside, in its animal form and standing bipedally on 2 hooves, was the 6-eyed doe. It was wearing a Duke Nukem shirt. Solace slammed the door.
Solace,
said Fen.
I know what it's like to...
Tell Devil to go home,
said Solace.
It isn't her turn yet.
I told you the shirt was too much,
said Devil, her voice muffled by the door.
It was never going to work anyway,
said Angel. She looked at Solace.
It wasn't the shirt, was it?
It was the shirt.
After 10 more fake-outs.
Footnote. Falataire, Amaryllis, Grak, Cowboy Grak, Cowboy Falataire, me, Hessional's head. A zombie version of her youngest child, Superman, and Reimer. She fell for Reimer.
Solace forced Angel and Devil to both stay in the apartment until the real Reaper came, took away their phones, and made sure to confirm that neither were thespians. It took hours, but there was eventually another knock at the door. Solace answered, with the Fens behind her.
I knew it,
yelled Angel. She pointed at the Reaper's solemn face.
The tattoo mage from Baron Jewel.
The man did not react to what she had said. He crouched low so he could fit through the entrance, and his worn, wide-brimmed hat scraped against the top of the doorframe. He appeared even older than Solace had earlier, although Fen didn't know how the Brosha looked as they aged, other than that they were long-lived. His skin was very weathered and a light brownish color, with hints of beige and copper. He was as tall as any of the Brosha, one of the tallest common mortal species on Ereb, very thin, but still muscular, carrying the kind of sinewy brawn that came with someone who stayed very active well into advanced age. Other than his hat, which wouldn't have been out of place in Cowboy Grak. He was wearing the worn clothes of a simple peasant. He had a long, thin beard, white as snow, that went down to his hips. The Fens merged, smiled at him, and curtsied.
It is an honor to meet you, fellow gamer. I am Oakley Skunkvine, Baroness of Brast. This is my live-in bangmaid, whom I have yet to name. Please refrain from speaking to her or making prolonged eye contact. Those are privileges she is expected to earn.
The Reaper glanced at Fen.
No,
he said.
It is not you.
Fen looked back at Solace.
So do you know this guy? Somebody from your grove? Second Empire officer? Former lover? I'm hoping for a throwback with serious thematic significance.
Paishep,
said Solace.
Orang Solas,
said Paishep.
Fen,
said Fen.
Paishep, the name rings a bell. Wait, don't tell me. I know where to find this.
She walked over to the table in the living room, where Devil had left a binder containing a copy of their complete collection of supplementary canonical worth the candle reference material. Fen was sure that Paishep hadn't made it into the mass market edition, so she flipped to the stuff pertaining to the original.
Let's see. A brief description of Erb, the Apocrypha, Council of Arches. Here we are. The Exclusionary Principle, 9th edition.
Fen found the listing on Paishep. She briefly looked at the page, not so much skimming as glancing at it.
Oh, what? The farmer? This is your final boss, Solace? The farming exclusion guy?
Footnote. If you haven't read the Exclusion Splat book, the farming exclusion guy is more than enough information about Paishep's background to make it through the rest of this story. He farms. He was excluded for farming. He once farmed so hard that he permanently displaced hundreds of thousands of people from their homeland and caused a small migration crisis. Less is more.
Solace shrugged.
My guess was onion, by the way. What I wouldn't do for that threesome.
Fen flipped the binder around and held it up so both Solace and Paishep could see. Above his article was a nice painting of a man on a hill overlooking a beautiful spread of hilly farmland.
You can't see him from the front, but you don't look much like the guy in the picture.
I am familiar with the illustration,
said Paishep.
It is a poor depiction of the verdant fields. The portrayal of my farmland is underwhelming when compared to its actual glory.
He took a step towards the book to peer closer at the image.
Before now, I have never bothered to look at the man. It is extremely true to life, but it is not me. His name was Bay Lant, and he was a protégé of mine during the years of my early life when I had such things. He once bruised a plum.
Was he a good farmer?
Asked Fen.
As I have said,
Paishep.
He once bruised a plum. But I did not come to speak of manners of the dirt with non-cultivators.
He looked at Solace.
No.
He shook his head.
That is wrong. You were a practicing flower mage.
I was,
said Solace. She smiled.
You have done your research.
Fen gasped.
I remember. He's on the list. That's where I remembered his name from. Not the exclusionary principle. I never read that crap. He's one of the unimportant characters that got permission to read the publisher's edition.
She pointed at him again.
How did you do it? Are you in league with the tattoo mage from Baron Jewel?
I have had the great honor of meeting Ezekiel twice in the afterlife,
said Paishep. He closed his eyes and tilted his head, as if recalling a fond, distant dream.
He is a man I hold in the highest regard, but no, I cannot say we are allied in any lasting way.
He looked at the painting in Solace's living room hallway, walked over to it, and tenderly touched his fingers to the paper, and then the wooden frame that surrounded it. Someone had replaced the abstract watercolor of Solace's family with a crayon drawing of one large green stick figure shooting lightning at 8 smaller green stick figures. A crying six-eyed oval loomed large in the foreground. Solace frowned and turned to Fen, who folded her arms.
I needed something to thicken the broth. Didn't think you'd notice.
I do not know why I was granted access to the text,
said Paishep.
I never cared to ask. As for you, Urang Solace, I have an offer to extend, if you are open to hearing it.
He was still examining the frame.
The tree that was used to build this frame should have been grown in soil with a higher concentration of nitrogen.
An offer?
Asked Solace.
I'm not striking a deal to let you keep it. I would be disappointed to learn that was how you have maintained your success.
Pyshep continued to stroke the sides of the frame.
There was a boschworm nest near the tree. They don't burrow into the wood, but they change the composition of the dirt.
He's just showing off,
muttered Fen. Pyshep turned around.
My proposal can wait. I would like to learn more about you. To talk.
Fen was still reading through Pyshep's article.
Wait, this says he's about 400 years old, so you're roughly the same age? Did you both know each other? This must be about revenge.
I know of Solace extensively through my reading, but this is our first encounter,
said Pyshep.
I did not know who I would be meeting when I came.
He looked at Fen.
My guess was also onion.
Fen looked off to the side.
Oh, I get it. Solace? The Kranteks were farmers too, right? Your original home must have been one of the places that Pyshep took over with his farm.
No,
said Solace.
I was on the opposite side of the hex. I once knew a man visiting our grove who claimed to be an exile from one of the kingdoms his fields swallowed. He was a very loud snorer.
Her eyes unfocused, in the way that they usually did when she was thinking deep into the past.
In retrospect, I think he was lying. That is the most direct link that I can think of.
Fen grinned.
You hear that, Pyshep? She hasn't forgotten about what you did to her.
She gestured to Solace's face.
She still chooses to wear the scars from those snores as a reminder. It was a mistake coming here today. You planted a seed called vengeance, and it's time for the harvest.
It is admirable that you try to search for these connections,
said Pyshep.
But in our competition, we will find enough conflict to drive us. We are two players in a zero-sum game. This is as compelling of a motivation as any inciting incident. Your inability to provide me with real competition will not diminish my victory.
There's nothing quite like the homespun humility of the common farmer,
said Fen.
You view humility as many do, a natural outgrowth from the advancement of skill,
said Pyshep.
This is an unfortunate myth. Humility, the forms of it venerated by most societies, is present within the masters of a given art, but never the master. It is an emotional response bonded to silver and bronze, a manner of self-soothing for those on the lesser podiums.
That is a very bleak attitude,
said Solace.
It is only the truth,
said Pyshep.
Your position as second is deceptive. It conceals the most. We are farther apart than you know.
So you do have more hidden runs,
said Solace. She smiled and seemed to take the confirmation well.
What are they down to?
It would not matter if I told you,
said Pyshep.
The gap of power between us, wide as it is, cannot be conveyed quantitatively.
It's a number,
said Fen.
Numbers are but one measure of themselves,
said Pyshep, looking at Solace.
I have watched your best efforts. I have seen your discoveries. There are pockets of wisdom in you, but you do not understand worth the candle. You share the common misinterpretation. You have failed to note the inconsistency.
He glanced at the sky, squinting, before returning his attention to Solace and Fen.
Recall, what are the first lines of spoken dialogue in Worth the Candle?
I think it's a fortnight joke,
said Fen.
Not from the counterfeit,
said Pyshep.
The original.
The soldier's speech on the plain,
said Solace.
Yes, the soldier implores the exiled prisoners to survive,
said Pyshep.
I can't say if the wording is purposeful. My inclination is that it was not, but it is precise. Strength through adversity, righteousness through struggle. The first words of any story have a special weight to them. We can see that this is not merely a soldier speaking to a prisoner. This is a creator advising his own avatar as he unfastens the shackles, and by extension, advising the audience. Did the dungeon master intend this? Doubtful, based on what I know of it. But that is the message. That is the true belief of the author, buried beneath self-delusion and artistic flourish.
Solace, Scenario 6,
said Fen, who loved fake contingency plans.
Blue in the bottle alert. We've got ourselves a soliloquist.
Pyshep stretched the straps of his overalls with his thumbs.
The authority is for all practical purposes the same entity as the dungeon master, and the same as the junipers. I do not care to distinguish between them. We are not meant to. Author, authority. Knowing this, if one asks it what it believes to cause the condition of an individual to improve, as I have done, they will receive a long and qualified answer, and at the center of that answer will be prosperity. It will rattle them off: safety, freedom, pleasure, community, time, health, knowledge, wisdom. It believes that the greatest foe is scarcity. If only you provided more resources, if you only gave more to all would improve. This view is empathetic, but it is the core of anti-narrative thinking. Yet it is espoused in a work that also promotes the power of narrative.
Alfric?
Said Fen.
Footnote. This is Druidic for I disagree with your interpretation of the text, and will not have sex with you.
The authority is our demiurge, an artisan of the material,
said Paishep, ignoring them.
It has every reason to believe that it is all-knowing and in control, but that is only because it is incapable of perceiving the true nature of the immaterial aspects of narrative. The cognitive dissonance throughout the book is overpowering. The writer believes in narrative wholeheartedly. It has seen the power it holds and has used that power to its own ends. It understands it with knowledge so fine and intricate, no others could replicate its work. But its flaw is that it cannot bring itself to confront what narrative logically necessitates. That true mastery over self is achieved through suffering. This is the contradiction in the Worth the Candle.
There it is.
Fen rolled her eyes.
Even the farmers are talking about narrative now.
Farmers were the first to speak of it,
said Paishep.
We credit the invention of narrative to hunter-gatherers on the basis of dim renditions on the walls of caves. But this is ahistorical. Agriculture preceded culture. It would have been impossible for a people to weave a proper tale without first attaining mastery over the land. Anyone who has ever planted anything knows of narrative. The life of a single crop in a field is a grand plot in miniature.
He stared at Fen.
The devil is the superior.
The Fen split. Angel pulled her head back.
Excuse me?
The arrow,
said Paishep.
She confronted the greatest man in the history of the world and bested him in a direct challenge. You did not. This struggle was not as trivial as you want to assume. It produced a foundational shift in her character for the better.
I think he's on to something,
said Devil. Angel narrowed her eyes. She had a hunch.
Are you a thespian?
No,
said Paishep.
Your instinct is to assume that I am a hoax rather than confront yourself. More evidence of my point. The arrow, narratively, can be seen as the pinnacle of your growth and pain throughout Worth the Candle. It is loosened from Devil's bow after her greatest period of struggle, and where does it end up? In Uther's calf. A subtle nod to Achilles' heel, and a deliberate one, Uther himself remarks on the benefits of a classical education not a few chapters earlier. In Devil's victory, she found his weakness, and transferred her own weakness to him.
She was trying to bounce it into his asshole,
said Angel.
Showing her that she still has mountains to climb,
said Paishep.
She reaches what she assumed to be her pinnacle, and finds more challenges awaiting her. As shall we all.
Sorry, Solace,
said Devil with a grin.
I'm on Paishep's side now. So to get this straight,
said Angel.
Your idea is that people don't suffer enough? Maybe we should get the authority to reinstate the hells. Say what you want about the unending torture. It really built a lot of character. What do you think gives you the right to criticize a genius?
Asked Devil. Paishep shook his head, his long beard waving more than was reasonable, given how slow the motion was.
You are attacking a straw man. I do not think that a man can be bound and cast into flame and then expected to develop. Obviously, suffering cannot be the only component to spur brilliance. The authority acknowledges this. With the retcon of the hells, it knows it serves no narrative purpose except as a deception to spur another. But it must be present. Pain is the one article that cannot be replaced. Read the history of the Pendraig family. Generations of weeds from Uther's seed, spoiled, short-sighted, weak, cruel, corrupt, all provided with untold wealth, resources, and education. Among that failed crop, which few distinguished themselves. The ones who chose, or were forced, to take the hard path. The exiled orphan who cared enough about the masses to suffer a taste of barren bread. The soldier who spent his entire life in search of the flimsiest excuse to initiate conflict. It is not the motives or the circumstances behind the actions that cause growth. It is in the action itself, the tolls incurred.
You're only choosing that as an example. Because you're a farmer, and you like that you get to use the flower analogy,
said Angel. She paused and made a bashful face.
I guess I do that a lot with archery, too.
Engage with what I say,
said Pyshep.
Do not deflect. The greater Fen would not run as you do.
I probably would,
said Devil.
Listen to us both tell a joke while separated, and then try and tell me I'm the lesser Fen,
said Angel.
I'm the funny one.
Yes,
said Pyshep.
You are. Once again, this proves my point.
I take it all back,
said Devil.
I'm cheering for Solace. This man has no appreciation for skilled humorists.
Pyshep shook his head.
Humor is not a skill.
It is in the game,
replied all three women together.
It is degenerated humility,
said Pyshep.
Levity is a chemical pesticide, always poisoning more than is intended. To quip is to tacitly accept failure. The lampshades you hang cast their shadows on your soul.
Devil watched his beard sway.
And you never use pesticide? It's like anything else. The dose makes the poison.
He turned a pair of calloused palms upwards so they could both see.
I would not have a toxin deprive my hands of their stories.
Angel was about to reply when she looked over at Solace, who was staring thoughtfully at his hands. She had hardly said anything since Pyshep entered the room, and as she began to wonder how she was taking any of this, she looked at them, smiled, and turned around to walk back to the other room. The three of them followed her and watched as she sat, picked up the stone, and began to start a new game.
Don't stop,
said Solace.
I'm listening.
Do you like Worth the Candle, Urung Solace?
Asked Pyshep.
I understand why it was written and who it was written for,
said Solace.
There are many small things about it that I appreciate.
Pyshep sat on the floor next to Solace.
And the game?
It's been a welcome distraction for me,
said Solace.
But my interest in it is fading. What do you think about it?
Worth the Candle is one of the greatest stories ever told. This is only by the dint of comparison, as it is an awful book and a failed project. In the 91st chapter, during a flashback, Alcida is described as the last of Uther's knights, which contradicts the 12 other occasions in the story where Ravenmasters is stated or implied to be the final knight herself. This is only one failure of many.
That was probably a flashback from before Raven joined Uther's party,
lied Angel.
Not that I'm going to go out of my way to defend Worth the Candle.
It was not,
said Pyshep.
This event is set years after the foundation of the First Empire, during Uther's struggles in the Boundless Pit. Raven appears in the same scene later herself.
But those flashbacks were Bethel's approximations of memories of what had happened before she was uplifted with Entads, right?
Asked Angel.
That narration was her description of Alcida from a scene she was only present for as a non-sapient entity. She might have gotten it wrong.
No,
said Pyshep, his gruff voice rising.
We cannot invoke the narrative to explain away clear failures. Is there any purpose within the story that is served by Bethel being incorrect in this instance? Were there any other similar erroneous details or misrepresentations of the truth in her recollection? Was this supposed distortion ever brought up again later? No. These pithy justifications have no explanatory power. It is a stain on the work.
You keep talking about it like it didn't actually happen. But even if you think the Dungeon Master had his hand on the scale to that degree, it's a tiny fucking nitpick.
Angel threw her hands up.
Is that your big theory on literary analysis? Being pedantic as shit?
Footnote. Fen is being disingenuous here, because she loves being pedantic as shit about tiny nitpicks in Worth the Candle. She actually already knew about the specific Alcida line that Pyshep was bringing up, not because she cared, but because it was ammunition to bother me with. Raven is called the last knight multiple times in the book, but that is in reference to her being the last living knight, not the last to join. So I don't know what Pai Shep was thinking. Fen should have brought that up, because that was the argument I gave to her when she annoyed me with this shit, but she probably wasn't listening. I am not petty for arguing about this.
My approach to critique takes everything into account,
said Pai Shep.
I only chose that flaw because it was the simplest and the one you were most likely to comprehend. I apologize for the misunderstanding. I was modeling your behavior from your last appearance in the epilogues, and I did not anticipate that your character would regress in the time since. When you merge back together with your better half, you will likely gain the insight necessary to appreciate the severity of the error.
I take it all back again. This guy's awesome,
said Devil.
Team Pai Shep all the way.
She looked up at him.
I never doubted you for a second. I was playing the other side for information.
Angel walked over to the statue of the zombie hand and picked it up, swinging it gently in the air to test it.
Solace, is cleaning up blood a pain in the ass here?
You need consent to assault anyone,
said Solace.
We're not so far down that it is implied to be given simply from entering.
Oh, don't worry, he's nuts. He'll let me do it.
She turned back to look at Pai Shep.
Won't you?
Yes,
said Pai Shep. She walked over to him slowly, testing the weight of the trophy in her hands like a baseball bat.
But not out of guilt,
said Fen.
Not like Manifest or Ard.
Footnote. Ard, a former god of Erb, resides in the lowest heaven, where he has pledged to remain until he has been personally forgiven by everyone he killed for heresy against his domains. He has also killed a huge number of people for other reasons, but they are not covered by the pledge.
Or those others who let people hurt them as penance. Not for my benefit, not for Solace's.
No,
said Pai Shep.
For yours?
Said Angel. Pai Shep met Angel's eyes and said nothing. She laughed and set the trophy back down.
I think that about does it for me. This guy's too much. I got enough of this crap from the elves. I'm gonna go.
She looked at Devil.
You too. He said you weren't funny, come on.
Devil thought about it, nodded, and merged back with Angel. Solace frowned and stopped the game, turning away from the screen.
You're really leaving? I can kick him out.
Don't bother,
said Fen.
We're basically at the end. I can tell this is what's going to bring on that cathartic breakthrough we were talking about. I don't know how Mary and Val went about it when they were doing their therapy sessions, but I think I'm going to hand you the POV character slot and let you work through the last bit on your own. We have a deal with Noon. We're going to grant him full access to our memories after the first few 100 years and have him write a collection of stories about the more interesting stuff. The climax of this one would work better from your perspective.
Even as you deride it, you cannot help but defer to the power of narrative,
said Pai Shep.
It is to take breath and deny the existence of air.
She held a long sniff and then quickly exhaled.
I see air as more of a stylistic choice.
Footnote. As seen in Cowboy Grak 4. These lead boots are made for spacewalking, which to me is where the franchise should have ended. Did we really need a sequel about his hat?
Pen winked at Solace and exited the room. Solace had anticipated a brief reprieve from Pai Shep's speeches, but as soon as the door was closed, he continued.
Unlike Angel, you will have no issue understanding the more complex faults. In Worth the Candle, there are 8 more right parentheses than left parentheses. This imbalance creates a deficiency of meaning.
What do you want from me?
Asked Solace. She tried to make the question sound inquisitive rather than annoyed, a skill that had once come easier to her.
Again, I'm not going to stop playing until I break the record.
Pai Shep stroked his beard.
Insight, growth, advancement. There are lessons I can learn. There are stories. There is the annihilation and composition of understanding. There is progress.
Could you please be more specific?
Asked Solace.
I want the number to go down,
said Pai Shep. Solace did not know what to make of Pai Shep. He reminded her of many people she had known. His earnestness especially made her think back to some of the druids. But of anyone, he brought Uther to mind, a man she'd never met. Pai Shep was the anti-Uther. Where the Lost King had wanted to escape the story, Pai Shep wanted it to consume him. They had both come to the same understanding of the narrative, only differing in their conclusions. Pai Shep was strange, but no stranger than a woman who spent her days mourning the living.
She entrusted you to confront me in her absence,
said Pai Shep.
You seem disinterested.
She was. The first time she had come close to retaking the record, there had been a rising excitement that grew whenever she progressed, and that had gone away. Even as she was on the cusp of getting the record again now, she could not disguise her boredom. Fen had done a good job of pointing out the absurdity of what she was doing and reminding her of what she was missing, and there were few secrets left to find in Worth the Candle, if any. Repetition had long stripped the game of any genuine entertainment value. She wanted to stop playing.
I don't even think she actually left the apartment,
said Solace.
That's why I didn't argue with her about it. She's probably waiting now in the living room.
I left figuratively,
yelled Fen, who sounded like she was pressed up against the door.
Trust the method. I'm deferring to the power of narrative.
Pai Shep nodded.
The reverence in her tone is mockery, but her exit is legitimate. It should be respected.
Solace let out a quiet sigh.
I asked about Worth the Candle because I am growing disinterested in it as well,
continued Pai Shep.
The counterfeit is interesting in its own way, but it is not what I have been seeking. I have tried other games from Earth, from the other side, the heavens. They do not offer a challenge. I wish for something more, and I have found it. There is another option, for a select few.
Solace realized what he meant. She had never considered that.
You mean turning the original into a game?
Said Solace, her voice soft again.
I played it for only a moment,
said Pai Shep.
I began and opened my eyes. I was bound in chains. There were men in uniforms, other prisoners, but I was in a vessel carved from fungus and paper, like nothing I have ever seen. It wasn't the plane. When I realized what it was, what I was playing, I stopped. The real Worth the Candle is predicated on the protagonist being the Juniper of that time. A true first-person version of it cannot exist with another player. If one tries, it does not try to fulfill a logical impossibility. It makes a new game. A self-actualized version of the player crafting a new world of challenges for their weaker counterpart to overcome. Our own dungeon masters, herbs, stories.
If Solace had understood Amaryllis and Fen correctly, Pai Shep wasn't describing anything that any person couldn't ask the authority to grant them in the form of a dive. It was not unique, besides having the official label of being worth the candle. At the time, the idea of it had not stood out among the many other temptations Amaryllis had tried to dangle in front of her. Solace still didn't want to do it, but after hearing Pai Shep describe it, she could see the appeal. She felt that it was not impossible for him to talk her into it, which surprised her.
Why did you stop playing?
Asked Solace, though she felt she already knew.
I need a benchmark,
said Pai Shep.
I must have another whom I can compare myself to. You will lose to me, I have no doubt, but you will be the spade by which I measure the depth of my hole, and vice versa. I regret sending my followers away during my life. I was right to think that they could never improve, but I did not understand the value in keeping them near me.
You said you didn't know I was here today,
said Solace.
If it had been someone who wasn't on the list.
I would have petitioned the authority,
said Pai Shep.
Being on the list grants one the right to make the request on the behalf on another. I place a high value on this, and I think it would have been granted.
He paused for a moment.
Juniper was a child when his narrative began. Our lives compared to his. Our adventures would be more like Uther's, a library instead of a few scant volumes. I imagine we would be harder on ourselves, greatly more adversarial than Juniper's dungeon master was to him. I believe you and I share that same impulse.
There would be no point to speedrunning that,
said Solace.
We would be playing different games.
We would be fighting merely to complete it,
said Pai Shep.
Runtime would likely cease to matter. We would contrast ourselves, our improvements, and our playthroughs abstractly through the methods of our choice. The games may not even be winnable.
Solace murmured. Pyshep twisted the ends of his beard.
Your conversation skills are atrocious, almost as terrible as onions. I am glad it bodes well.
He took a final glance at Solace and the trophy of the candle.
I have made my offer. It remains open indefinitely. If you come any closer to the record, I will post my best time.
Pyshep teleported away. Some of the dirt from his overalls was left behind on the floor, where he'd been sitting. Solace looked at it and wondered if he still grew anything. With multi-threading, it wouldn't have been that difficult to farm and play games at the same time.
He left,
she called.
Sorry, I can't hear you over the sound of me not being in the story anymore,
said Fen. She really would have been a great druid. It was interesting to Solace that Fen had compared Pyshep's way of thinking to elven philosophy, when she had thought of Uther instead. Solace carried on playing alone for a while, and then messed up a trick near the start at the Fleshsmiths and got Amaryllis killed. She reset the game, then paused and put the stone down. She folded her legs and began to meditate. Meditation was the reason Solace was in her current predicament. She started playing Minecraft as a spiritual aid, and it had spiraled out of her control. But now, she hoped it could help. There was a druidic ritual called Ainyons Sikat, which was said to be the Zorisad Yusuvun of the mind. It gave the caster the ability to relive old memories in search of insight. Unlike Zorisad Yusuvan, it had no grave risk, but the insights it would provide were too cryptic for all but the most skilled druids to interpret. Solace couldn't cast it, since she wasn't a druid anymore, so she decided to pretend instead. She thought flashbacks were hackneyed, but she wanted to be a good sport and have one as Fen had suggested, though it was harder than she thought. She had been alive too long, the wreckage of 400 years of tragedy and sentiment too much for her to sort through. What to choose? The last conversation she'd ever had with her mother, a comment about the weather, a grunt. Her induction ceremony, the feeling of living for something greater than herself, giving birth at the festival of Galal and Bills, and puzzling pile of shit she once found, torn tapestry, the realization that Nustel had known his Zorisad Yosevun wouldn't work, the moment immediately after she had cast it herself, having already accepted her end, and suddenly feeling the rush of wind from a speeding train a foot away from her as it barreled on its way.
Footnote. When the party first teleported to Solace, she was standing on train tracks in a clearing.
A joke Heshnel had said that made her laugh. Instead of any of those memories, which had been left untouched in her mind for long enough to feel novel again, Solace thought about the cannibal. The campfire that night was brown. Visitors often tried ascribing special reasoning to the changing colors of the campfires, saying that it represented the emotions of the locus or the strength of the druids present in the grove. But it was nothing like that. It wasn't even magical. Raham, who was in charge of lighting the fires and keeping them going, liked to throw his own powders and dyes in with the logs to produce interesting effects. They were simple enough to make that a young child could have done it. They would have told them that, had they asked. They did ask questions, the itinerants, the curious visitors, the passing merchants. They asked more than they should have. They asked in the wrong ways. They asked indiscriminately, in the manner that always had the druids weaving and dancing around the strikes of their inquisitions. But never about the fire. Solace wondered why that was, why they felt immediately comfortable, making assumptions about certain details, while incessantly prying into others. What was it about the flame that made it so easy for them to accept their own intuitions about it, compared to all that they could not? The swallow, circling the flames, squawked, signaling the end of Yovemayog's time to think, and everyone became quiet. She was a middle-aged Anolia, a few spots in the circle away from Solace. Yovemayog was the grove's Maunal, the weakest and least wise druid in their grove. She had been a druid for 3 times as long as Solace had been alive, and had cast a single weak spell for each one of those lifetimes, which she liked to brag about. The locus had only acknowledged her presence once in all that time, during her induction, and knowledge of the language had never come to her as it did to almost all druids. Solace had been a druid since the last spring, and was the most powerful druid in the grove. It was a much less esteemed role than Munah. She had been casually informed about it the morning after her induction, when she asked her seniors for assistance with a basic ritual, and was told that there was nothing left for anyone else in the grove to teach her, and that she would teach them instead. Solace had spoken to Yovemiog, and remarked on the unfairness of it, that she was granted as much strength as she had without working for it. In response, she told Solace a fable.
A stag with wings and 12 eyes entered a village and attacked a miller, accusing him of insulting the stag by not bowing to him. The miller killed the stag and ground his wings and made bread of them, and gave the bread to his neighbor, a widow, who ate from it and died. A passing snake swallowed the widow's body and then requested bread from the miller, who killed him, ground his scales into bread, ate from it, and died.
Yovemiog told her to fast and meditate on this fable for 3 days while she pondered its meaning. Solace did, and came back with her interpretation, asking Yovemiog if she had understood. Yovemiog told her that it was not correct, and Solace fasted and reflected for another 3 days, and then tried again, and was told that she was still wrong. Solace was not frustrated, but she did not think that she could decipher the fable, so she asked Yovemiog to reveal the answer, which she did. The fable's lesson was that Yovemiog was a bad druid, and bad druids were not good at inventing clever fables. Yovemiog continued the fireside story where the person before her had left off. She was only the second to tell the story that night, which gave her power, since it meant that she would be helping to set the tone. The druids told many kinds of stories during fireside storytelling, and there were no rules, but it was good form to copy the style of the speakers that had gone before.
The man reached for his winnings, but the bandits, thinking they had been cheated during their game, threw the man from the highest point of the tower, ignoring his protests.
Spoke Yovemiog. The circle gave her their full attention, both the tellers surrounding the fire and those listening behind them.
The man fell from the tower and into a deep hole, but landed on a cart filled with wool and was unharmed. He walked home and did not realize that he had lost one of his eyes until the next day.
The swallow above the fire squawked. Anyone could spend as much time as they wanted speaking, but Yovemiog never contributed much, and everyone began to talk again as the next druid in the circle, Ftayai, pondered how they would continue the story. The bird knew how much time everyone needed to think, and Ftayai always took a long time, so most of the crowd began conversing, as if they did not expect to be interrupted for a while. A deep, mild voice came from Solace's right side.
Ruminating?
Asked Arwisk. He was a young man about Solace's age, a pustule mage, and a druid of some remarkable skill himself. He had a pleasing jawline that was accentuated by a thick beard of blisters. Solace recalled that the carpet matched the drapes.
No,
said Solace, smiling.
I already ate, just thinking about something.
It's considered improper to try to plan the story out ahead of your turn,
said Arwisk.
It'll make you try and twist the story unnaturally later, when your original plan no longer fits.
Her smile grew. He was a hypocrite.
I missed you,
she said. He smiled back. The intentions behind it were so obvious that she couldn't believe she had ever failed to recognize them.
Did I go somewhere?
You and everyone else here have been dead for centuries,
said Solace.
I'm an old lady pretending to cast Aignant's Sikat.
Why pretend?
Asked Arwisk.
That should be an easy one for you.
I'm not a druid anymore,
said Solace.
Orang Solace, not a druid?
Arwisk laughed.
I'll take your word for my death, but you can't make such bold claims about the future and expect to be believed. How do I go?
A monster called a skent suffocates you after you kill its master,
said Solace.
A noble death,
said Arwisk. He appeared unbothered by the news.
Surely I deserve a reward for my bravery and sacrifice.
No,
said Solace.
You weren't that forward. You never would have had the confidence to say that. I must give my past self some credit for not noticing.
Arwisk chuckled again.
I might have been less handsome too,
he said.
But as a memory, embellishment is my right.
He didn't stop smiling, but his face grew more serious.
Why did you come back to this moment? Am I that important to you?
Asked Arwisk.
I understand if so. You aren't the first old druid to come back and see me.
The story from the circle tonight,
said Solace.
It's cosmically significant.
How?
We don't know it. But we are going to recount an episode of The X-Files,
said Solace.
In 400 years, I will play a card game with a teenage version of God, and then I will mention the stories we told at this fireside, and then God will ask me about that, but won't ask for any details about the stories themselves. But if he had, I might have mentioned this one, and there was a very small chance he might have realized that I was talking about an episode of The X-Files, and then later learned that the episode of The X-Files in question had a minor role performed by an actor who, later on during God's adventure, would try and eat him and his friends. This might have been mildly amusing to him in hindsight. God wrote a book about it later, and the part of the story when we had the conversation where any of this might have come up was not deemed relevant enough to be inserted into the main text, so it was placed into a separate bonus story instead.
That's what I would have guessed,
said Arwisk. Solace laughed. The swallow squawked. She looked at the smoke from the fire and followed it with her gaze as it rose toward the sky, past the branches of the trees above them.
Urez kappa tapiv,
whispered Solace.
Multi-thread assisted speed run, any percent worth the candle. First, OS, 1 hour, 57 minutes, 24 seconds. Second, The Reaper, 1 day, 5 hours, 5 minutes, 29 seconds.
Footnote. I will point out that even though PieShep is against humor, his username is a pun. I don't think this is necessarily hypocrisy. He might not consider puns to be jokes.
Third, Saul Elevator Fax Redford, 12 days, 19 hours, 21 minutes, 59 seconds. Fourth, Apex Lex, 15 days, 3 hours, 53 minutes, 24 seconds. Fifth, Embrace the Jump Chain, 15 days, 10 hours, 41 minutes, 36 seconds.
To Fenn's surprise, Solace had posted her last run in the same way that PieShep had posted his, a video with only the timer visible. He was standing outside the front door. He knocked again.
I understand that it seems narratively appropriate to refuse to tell me how you achieved this as a way of mirroring my own actions. But that is making the mistake of choosing the obvious path. Did Worth the Candle settle for the complacency of convention? Yes, frequently. But we can rise above its shoddy example. We can grow.
They continued to ignore him.
So how the hells did you do it?
Asked Purgatorio.
Oh.
Solace flapped her hand in the air. She had the kind of innocent smile Fenn hadn't seen from her since they were on Erb.
I just found a new Greg exploit. It's ridiculously broken, but you don't want the whole rundown. Trust me. It's overcomplicated. You've probably seen enough that you could figure out the broad strokes, if not the precise method. Think pustule magic.
Fenn cocked her head.
Right, but you already tried that. That method can quell Greg's influence in the short term, but...
Think pustule magic and skin magic, star magic, and tree magic,
said Solace, as if revealing a big secret.
Oh,
said Fenn.
Oh!
She didn't actually get it, and she didn't care. When she had started learning about speedruns, she expected the best techniques to feel intuitive, like secret cheat codes, and instead they were boring and intricate. It was better to fake understanding and move on.
Footnote. She made a giant candle. There is more to it than that, but she made a giant candle.
Solace laughed.
Can't believe I missed it for that long. I'm happy to be done with it.
She picked up one of her trophies and threw it over the roof.
Help me with this.
Fenn lobbed the Pikmin through the television. To her delight, it made the sound again.
You know, with Amaryllis, at the time, I was telling myself that I was just trying to get information without needing to talk to an assistant. But on reflection, no, I think I did just want to annoy her.
Solace laughed.
I really should apologize. That was cruel.
It takes one cold-hearted monster to treat her own mother like that,
said Fenn.
You would have done well in prison.
She thought about that.
Actually, never mind.
Because I was murdered in a prison?
Asked Solace.
Yeah,
said Fenn.
By the way, I knitted you the cool hat I was talking about,
said Solace.
I realized you didn't want it, so I threw it out. But it's the thought that counts.
Footnote. Solace understands what I like about Fenn. If you read that earlier footnote about the hat thing and thought I was complaining, I wasn't. I'm the juniper who won. Amaryllis is amazing, and so is the debauched bachelor lifestyle of Other Side June, which I won't elaborate on. Those are nice consolation prizes. But I'm the narrator. I'm the one who likes narrative for its own sake. I got to choose what made it into Worth the Candle. The dungeon master never forced me to include as many digressions about storytelling as I did. That was my choice, and I'm happy that I made it. Angel and Devil don't try to make everything into a joke. They try to make everything into an anecdote. They pull on the tiniest threads of life until they are stories worth telling, and that requires them to embrace having the personalities that they do, because narratives are innately absurd and convoluted. I love Fen because she would rather have the story of the hat than the hat.
It is,
said Fen. She ran her hands through her hair.
I should mention this while we're still here, or June will give me shit later. You know how sometimes somebody sees something crazy, but it's not that they are actually seeing it, it's just what they think they want to see? Well, this isn't that. I wanted to see this more than anybody, and I couldn't, but everybody else could. In the locust's heaven, there's this one tree away from all the others, and the locust doesn't let anybody get close to it. Even us, it starts bleeding and physically pushes us away if we do. Everybody else in the party that's looked at it says that if you stand in this one spot, the leaves look like a cloak. I disagree. I don't see it. But I thought I should bring it up once, since I'm the only one who doesn't.
Fen would have brought it up earlier, but she knew that Solace would have dismissed it.
I might have to give it a look myself later,
said Solace.
If that's what it takes to settle the argument.
They spoke some more and said goodbye, and Solace teleported away. Fen snapped her fingers as soon as she was gone.
Damn it, I forgot to work that Bambi joke in.
She walked back to the main room and spent a moment staring at the stick figures again, before leaving. It occurred to her that there was a very good name she could use for a daughter. It wasn't a pun.
Shit,
she sniffed.
Valencia's rubbing off on me?
Mrs. Fennett returned to Cowboy Grak 5. Yet, Another Fistful of Obols, and in something of a contemplative mood, fanned herself while watching Cowboy Grak stoically T-pose in front of the setting sun. They were at the funeral for Cowboy Grak's hat, and the townspeople had arrived in their oiliest wear to pay their respects to the high-crowned hero that had saved them all. Even the real narrator was there. He was a little scrawnier than the other Junes, which she liked. It reminded her of when they had first met.
Don't cry, June,
said Purgatorio.
It's one of those pretend funerals. I don't actually have it in me to fuck with the status quo like that. I'm too precious with my characters. Once Cowboy Grak finally manages to admit that he misses him, the town hatter runs in and fixes him up.
If only we could fix you,
said narrator.
I guess the moral of the story is that the way to help grieving mothers is to make fun of them,
said Fen.
The more dead children, the meaner you need to be.
I think what you did worked, because you put in the effort to become friends with her and learn what her boundaries were,
said June.
I don't think she had any big lesson to learn. She just needed someone to be with her while she worked through her shit.
Stop insinuating that I'm less socially inept than I let on. It's rude.
She sighed.
I wish we knew more sad people that I could work my magic on. Is your herb mother still unhappy? Her son was beheaded. I could do something with that.
No,
said June.
You already cured her depression. Remember Gracula?
Cowboy Grak sniffed.
That was a grieving sniff, not a congestion sniff,
said Fen.
He's about to break.
Did she tell you what her plans were?
Asked June. Fen shrugged.
We mostly talked about video games. She mentioned wanting to see if her kids would craft a 1-to-1 scale model of Khalidwitch with her. I hope they do it.
Did you invite her to do a Cowboy Grak sequel?
Please,
said Fen. She squeezed his hand.
Her time is too valuable for that.
End notes. It came out after I published this that Fen's Cowboy Grak 5. Yet Another Fistful of Obols is a nearly 1-to-1 ripoff of the popular elvish play Dostalies, roughly translated, The Hat Which Can Be Chosen. In hindsight, this explains some of the unconventional choices in the story, such as the scene where Cowboy Grak ritualistically devours a rival gunslinger who disrespected his hat's mourning chair. Fen is currently being sued from one of the low courts that was created to dole out justice respecting theft of intellectual property, although she has not yet responded to the summons.